Call the special city council meeting to order.
Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilperson Vining.
Here.
Lamore.
Here.
Felder. Whitman. Here. Iko Angeli.
He's excused. Do we have a quorum?
We have a quorum.
Clark, sorry.
Now we have a quorum.
A quorum, yes. Okay, so obviously the special city council meeting this evening is to review the fiscal year 2019-2020 proposed budget. I know that there's a lot of information that was sent out, and we'll just hear it all tonight. So, Mr. Pastou, if you could, any starts, introductions, or comments before we get started?
Appreciate the opportunity to present the proposed budget. We've got a pretty number of slides to go through here tonight in providing a broad summary of the proposed budget. In aggregate, we're looking at a gross budget in excess of $62 million. And so we'll try and keep it, summarize it as much as possible as we go through this. The first budget I want to go through is have Annette Knoll present the Downtown Development Authority budget, and then we'll get into the city operating budgets thereafter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Not yet.
I have to overlay either.
Turn it up.
How to
You'll be
figure-
fine.
Okay. All right. Thank you for allowing me to spend a few minutes this evening talking about the proposed fiscal year 2019-2020 budget for the Monroe DDA. Basically, I'm going to talk about 4 things this evening. One is the highlights from the current fiscal year that we're in. I always like to show a little bit or discuss a little bit about what's been going on because it somewhat helps to explain what we're going to be working on next. Then we'll cover the work plan for 2019-2020, the budget for 2019-2020, and then what I would call the watch list, or things that we want to make sure we're keeping an extra eye on that might impact budgets in future years. So does anyone have any questions about what I'm going to cover tonight? Okay. Right, so some of the highlights from this year, and I'm took a little bit of trying to think of the right word to say, but I took a little bit of liberty with this and showing things that we expect to be done by June 30th. So some of these things are still in process or in the works, but hopefully everything will be done by the end of June at the end of the fiscal year. And also there are some notations with some stars on them. You'll see, for example, completed the downtown master plan and a corresponding public information campaign. Those are items that were either in the DDA strategic plan or related to the downtown master plan. And I wanted to indicate those specifically to show that we are using the plans as foundation for the work that the DDA will be pursuing. So again, already covered the master plan, created a communications plan that is to be updated annually. This year, we created templates for our press releases, developed 2 e-newsletters. One is for the general public, called Downtown Monroe Matters. The other is specific to the business community, and that one's called In the District. We also created a template for a direct mail newsletter called Downtown Up Close. We have not issued one yet, but we do have the template ready for when there is items to be shared with the greater community. We created a marketing plan to be updated annually. This year, a calendar module was created so that any special event happening in the downtown can be found on one resource, and a strategy to go along with that. The tree lighting event was organized. There's a new rat card that replaced the business locator map. There was a full-page ad in Christmas Magic in Monroe guide. We are doing a cooperative advertising campaign on Nash Icon, and a business recruitment brochure is being developed right now. The board approved 2 facade reinvestment program projects. Those will likely commence spring into fall, so we may not see completion of those in the next couple months, but they have been approved for participation. We approved the selection of a new graphics design provider, completed extended strategic planning and budget processes. What you're going to see this evening was actually a culmination of about 4 months of work. So we did, instead of trying to convene a board and do all of this on one day, we're spreading it out over several months. It gives them a chance to digest and generate new ideas. But it is a more extensive work planning process that has been pursued. I'm going to say we've done this for the second year. So prior to 2 years of budgets, the work planning was not done as extensively. And then lastly, 2 more things, I'm sorry. Completed upper floor conversion case studies on 113 East Front and 12 and 14 West Front. And then initiated a project to create streetscape design standards. So we have a lot of different ideas for what streetscapes may look like, but what we're trying to do at this point is come up with a more definitive description of what any streetscape project moving forward would look like. So it would be attributes and amenities and things like that in future streetscape projects. Any questions about these so far?
Yep.
Okay.
Brian?
Yeah.
You said graphics design team. Who do you have in mind for that?
We are consulting with New Moon Visions. It's the same company that did the city's branding. That was put out for RFP last year, and we were using 20 Creative, but they ceased to do the graphics design any longer, so we went with the other provider that went through our RFP process.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to keep motoring. So more highlights, 2 slides. Completed a Riverwalk enhancement and expansion conceptual plan, hosted stakeholder meetings with business and property owners, installed spring and winter seasonal decorations in the 16 downtown planters, underwrote a cost of phased effort for more extensive tree maintenance than is normally done. That was actually done this last week by the city's forestry division. So if you happen to notice more in the core of the downtown that trees have been trimmed, that was through that effort. We also rejoined the National Main Street Center, which is somewhat a division of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They kind of separated a couple years ago, but the idea would be to renew that resource for the board to be able to use. We established a parking committee, and then established an ad hoc bylaws committee to review one section that did not receive a review at the last time the bylaws were updated. So in about another month and a half, you'll be seeing me again regarding the bylaw update, because this council will have to approve that. So again, wanted to reiterate that anything with the 2 stars was related to the downtown master plan or the strategic plan. So any questions about what we're working on this year? No? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the work plan for next year. We actually, again, started a process in early fall to do this. So it consisted of a number of different sessions for the board. The first was really a review of what's been going on, and then using the plans that we have to provide a basis for future work. And so there was considerable amount of time given to discussion about the board's goals and objectives and which projects would support those goals and objectives. We came up with a really long list of things to do. And then at the next meeting, they narrowed it down into priorities based on the resources that they had. And so what you're going to see is a little bit from each of the goals. They still have different projects from each of those goals, but we had to really be specific and a little bit more narrow than the big wish list. So the big wish list got shrunk into a smaller wish list. And so some of those projects include implementing the communications and marketing plans. There was the DDA Act was recodified last year and combined with a number of other economic development acts. And so it's now called Act 57 of 2018. And there's a very long name for what this act is, but it requires different mechanisms for mainly transparency and public information requirements. So we'll have to do a little bit of work to make sure that we're going to be consistent with what those new requirements are from the state act. So implement recommendations in the downtown master plan to activate storefronts. It may involve art treatments, art-focused treatments in the storefronts, really promoting more sidewalk shopping, more outdoor seating, things that businesses and property owners can do to make the streetscape more attractive. We don't have a specific work plan ready for this yet, but there have been some discussions about how best to move forward with some of those items. Working with the farmers market to enhance the market experience, setting aside funds for property acquisition and economic feasibility for the right opportunity. So this would be a property acquisition of a building or property in the downtown that makes sense according to some of the recommendations in the downtown master plan. The board would like to implement a project from the Riverwalk Enhancement Plan when it's complete. So we're going to go through when the plan is complete and select a project to implement. And then assist assist the city by funding alleyway improvements. So there's a alleyway project that's going to be done, and the DDA has pledged to contribute some dollars to make it go above and beyond just a basic mill and fill or repair to the alley. So if there are, I'm just trying to think offhand, if there's dumpster enclosures in the alley that needs to be done, pedestrian amenities in an alley that might need to be done, those are the types of things that this pool of funds would cover. Continuing with stakeholder meetings, which would be property owners and or business owners. So we set aside a few dollars for those. Implement strategies in the downtown master plan to improve parking management. So in the master plan, there were strategies for parking management, strategies for parking improvement. Very likely that the low-hanging fruit on this is more of the management strategies, and once we convene the parking committee, we'll have a better sense. But it seems at this point in time that if there's any changes to how long the time limitations are, where those time limitations may be, those are the types of things that would likely occur first. And of course, we need to communicate those changes out if any are made. And so they wanted to set aside a few dollars to be able to produce some sort of promotional materials for that. Where did I leave off? Complete the second phase of tree and lamppost maintenance. So, for example, the trees that you saw in the downtown, that's phase one. We're hoping to divide the downtown into more sections and pursue that next year as well. Conduct one upper floor conversion technical assistance project if there's interest. So we would do another competitive application period for that. Award 2 building rehabilitation projects if there is interest. The building rehabilitation project is really a revamping of the facade program. So it is, as of July 1st, going to be called the Downtown Reinvestment Program, and it provides funds for facades, of course, but expands the types of improvements that can be done in buildings. And so we're hoping to do 2 of those, provided that there's interest in applications from property owners. And then lastly, continuing to install spring and winter seasonal decorations in the downtown planters. So are there any questions about what's to come?
Any questions for Annette?
Okay, well, I'll get right into the budget numbers then. So we have revenue, and I've provided 3 years of, I'm sorry, Mayor.
I don't know if Councilman Felder received one when you passed it out.
Oh, no, you are not here.
Thank you.
This is actually just the work plan.
Sure.
So the whole budget is actually in the budget that the city
Sure.
Ed and his staff prepared. I'm just preparing highlights. When it comes to the DDA's budget, the council's role is basically to provide a funding threshold that we can't exceed. and I'll get to that in just a moment. So for the budget, the revenue we're expecting this year is $238,800. The large source of funds for the DDA is property taxes through what's called tax increment financing. If you ever want the lengthy explanation of how that works, please call me. I don't want to take up too much time this evening going over how that works. There is also personal property taxes. You'll notice a big red number on there. That's an actual loss to the DDA. When the state of Michigan in 2012 approved some property tax reform and eliminated personal property taxes for anything below $40,000. It hit the DDA very hard. The state is reimbursing a portion of that, so you'll see that on the next line. But it does significantly impact the tax increment financing revenues that the DDA receives. So again, total revenue, $238,800. On the expense side, I tried to categorize some of the appropriations so that you can see basically where the trends are, and make it real easy. Instead of saying, hey, we're spending $500 on office supplies, we've kind of lumped things a little bit together. So for staff, you'll see the requested amount in the budget this year is $52,088. That includes a part-time operations coordinator who works for the DDA, and then a portion of my time that I provide to support the work of the DDA. Overhead, which includes office supplies, copies, postage, audit of the financials at the end of the year, and insurance, $3,659 is that total. Other, which would include training and miscellaneous, and then memberships of $3,000. Facade improvements, we're going to change the titling of this when it's appropriate. Again, it's more now downtown reinvestment as opposed to strictly facades. Committee work, you'll notice is zero. Prior to 2018-2019 year, each of the committees had its own budget, and they were standing committees. We've now successfully phased that out and are phasing in the project-based work teams, so there no longer is a line item specific to any committees. Community promotion and advertising, $13,300. Parking management and improvement. Again, go back to the the work plan where we talked about perhaps having signage and some communication. Those types of things would be where what that would be spent on. Land and capital is $110,000. Again, that would be property acquisition. It would be design-related improvements. It could be the Riverwalk project. That's where that would be derived. Maintenance and seasonal decorations, $20,000. General contract services, $15,000. That would be the work of consultants to support activities of the DDA. And then lastly, debt transfer of $122,200. The DDA has pledged its TIF revenue to pay for a bond that was used to reconstruct the riverfront parking lot. That bond payment, there's a bond payment every year until fiscal year 2031, 2032. And that is the very first thing that the DDA has to account for in its budgeting process is the debt. So even though it appears last on the list, it's highest on the needs list. So the total expected expenditures, appropriations is $469,247. Yes, it is more than the revenue, and the source of the difference would be out of fund balance. The DDA board has funds in balance, and through discussion, they talked about their comfort level of what that fund balance should be. They would like to keep it at about $120,000. So with this expenditure, it brings it down to that about $120,000 level. Any questions about the budget? Okay.
What
why is the facade improvement so up and down at such a great degree?
Okay. For 2017, 2018, we did a pretty extensive mapping of the projects that were remaining. And so although a budget is established every year and projects are selected every year, they don't always get completed in the year. So in that particular year, we took an accounting of all the open cases and tried to close all those open cases so that there wasn't money necessarily being carried over from year to year. So you'll see a kind of a big lump sum because there were so many open programs. Last year, or this current year, because of budget priorities that the board established this year, they weren't giving out 4 $10,000 grants as they had done in the past. We only provided for 2 $10,000 grants. And actually that was an increase because when we originally proposed the budget last year, it was going to be 2 $5,000, capped at 5, but we ended up coming back to the council and asking to go up a little bit higher than that. So this year's would be around 21,300, and that accounts for those 2 projects plus 1 that was carried over from last year. Hopefully, we won't be carrying over more than 2 or 3 projects a year. But again, you'll see for the requested, it's 40. Chances are projects from this year are going to float over till next year. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Good.
So the watch list, again, wanted to discuss a little bit about the fund balance. We're going to draw down if all the projects in this particular work plan, in this particular budget are completed. We'll be drawing funds out of balance. The board's desired balance was $120,000, which represents about 40% of their annual total revenue. And so for future years, again, if this work plan is fully implemented for future years, if the board continues to concur that that is the fund balance that they would like to establish, then we'll have to do a balanced budget from this point forward. But we can't account necessarily for what future boards may want to do. That was the level that was decided upon for this year. Another issue to watch out for is the bond debt. The bond payments are escalating, and revenue is growing at a rate of, typically it's there's taxable value and state equalized value. We're held down to taxable value, so the growth in TIF can only grow so much unless there's new investment. So that being the case, we really have to remain mindful that this bond payment is growing. And the revenues are not necessarily growing at the rate that the bond payment is growing. So we're going to keep our pulse check on that, just to make sure that we're still able to do things and remain active as a board, but also remain mindful that the revenue at some point, the amount of revenue available for other projects is going to start shrinking. And then lastly, my time provided to the DDA is by contract with the city, so I'm a city employee that provides services to the DDA. The DDA has that contract through the end of this next fiscal year, and they have talked about having the employee, a director level employee back with the DDA. And my opinion at this point is, given all other conditions, it's probably not going to be feasible for them to do. So we've already kind of talked on the executive committee level about engaging the city in some conversation with how this relationship may continue, if it does, to make sure that the DDA has professional staffing. So that is the end of my comments. If there's any questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
Follow-up questions regarding the DDA proposed budgets and presentation on the highlights? Okay. Vince,
I could just add a couple items. Annette had indicated about the contract with the city and the DDA, and I think we do forecast that into the future that we would continue that relationship beyond the existing contract term. So when you look at not only the budget this upcoming year, but the following 2 years, that is contained in our proposed budget forecast as well. The other piece of it is there's a couple of you know, items addressing parking in the downtown. And one of the things, and it's not contained in the proposed budget, but the building authority has some funds from a grant many, many years ago that we should probably have a discussion about how to apply. It's a few $100,000, and there may be, you know, I'm thinking more in terms of the parking improvements serving the city hall and county campus, but it's probably time to go into considering that type of improvement as well. And so somewhere in the future, we'll talk about how we go about giving that some consideration. So it is it's been out there for a while, and I think we're at a point now where we're ready to kind of maybe pull the trigger and utilize some of the funds that have been sitting there. So.
Very well. Any follow-ups? Councilman?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just I guess 2 points. One is more of a point of emphasis, and this isn't so much a you thing as it is an everybody thing. All of the departments, but it affects you guys more closely because when we look at inputs and outputs in terms of what we're putting into the projects and the departments in terms of what we're getting out. Especially when we're talking about business development, we're talking about rate increases over time because we have tax increment financing. So the goal is to outpace what the growth otherwise would have been without the DDA support. And I think that I calculated, a 6.1% increase year over year, something like that. Maybe if I got it close, it was.
You mean the taxable value growth?
Yeah, 230,000 to 245,000, which I think does outpace growth. But if we could see some numbers as to how that compares to the rest of the city's taxable property, in addition to how we compare against other communities in terms of we are justifying the expenditure of this investment against, the impact that investment is making. And I think that it's making a positive one, but the success story is not that we gave out 2 facade grants. The success story is that we leveraged additional funding from private sources into the downtown by way of giving out 2 facade grants. The success story is not all these events that we're holding downtown. The success story is that we're outpacing growth in other parts of our community and in other communities' business districts as well. And I think that that's really what needs to be highlighted, both now and in the future. Now, keeping in mind that 6.1%, I think, is a respectable growth level. We're looking at budget increases of 33% and 23% year over year. Now, I understand that some of that is bonding, and that those are not long-term expenditures and that they're going to get paid down. And I know you talked a little bit about in the future, we're going to have to, do balanced budgets. The board's going to have to do balanced budgets to be able to stabilize their fund, going forward. But I think that the emphasis really needs to be, maybe I'm just saying this because, oh yeah, we're in budgeting season again, is that in the investments that we're making in our departments and especially in our downtown, what are we getting out of that? I think that in why I say that this isn't a you thing, this is an everybody thing, this is an us thing too. When we're looking at the Lazy Boy development, the Lazy Boy sub-area plan is not the success story. The success story is the private developer that we're leveraging as a result of doing the study. No one, right. If the city could get away with getting the developer without doing the study, we would have. And so I think that those things, especially when, when the public needs to be aware of, hey, the investments that you're making in our community, they're paying off. We just need to, I think that we all need to put that in more clear terms so that it can be better assessed.
Right. I think that's a newer concept for some of the activities of the board in the past. I don't necessarily know if they were too concerned with return on investment, but they are now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the statistics that you might be looking for are things that we intended to start tracking this next year anyway. So you might have to add a category on there.
Sure.
Keep in mind, though, that, when you compare one community to another, there's a lot of external forces within that. So although we can share some ideas or share some numbers about successes that other communities are having without looking at necessarily all of the economic conditions. It would be easy to say, hey, this community went up 20%, but we don't understand necessarily what represents that 20%. So I just want to put that kind of disclaimer in there that we can certainly research and provide some of that information, but without knowing the backstory, it might be hard to explain differences.
Fully recognizing that there are other positive externalities that occur as a result of having a downtown development authority. You know, walking downtown and having it be a nice tree-lined downtown with flowers about, you know, might not increase revenues to the city, but also makes it a nice place to live and visit.
There are
So
definitely a lot of intangibles about a downtown that other places don't necessarily have.
that's a fair point. Thank you, Annette.
Questions or comments?
Yeah.
See none?
Great. Thank
Thanks,
you very
Annette.
much.
Thank you. Mr. Pastu.
On to the city services. I think we're going to the presentation going forward here, just as by way of introduction and my recollection of the sequence of things. As I said, we got about a $62 million gross budget to go through here. We've got kind of a lineup of items that we'll go through and review. Going with Mr. Sell, starting with the calendar of events and the process, the budget process that is currently in place. So I'm buying time by mumbling, and it's so it.
Okay, good. Never know if I'm going to have to change some settings here to make this work or not. We're
It
good.
looks like it'll go.
Good. Okay.
We tested it earlier today to make sure it projected well. So
There it is. Okay. So you're ready for me to just go?
yeah, let's go.
Okay.
It's
I'm always glad to get to this point because it means a huge amount of work has been completed and we get to hand it over to the city council to review now. It's kind of like a breath of fresh air. So I'm happy to be here. So this is kind of what Vince was referring to as our schedule of events here tonight. Of course, Vince has already done the introduction and that just did the DDA budget. I'm going to do a quick process calendar and then Vince is going to give some general overview, and then there's a lot of me talking about a lot of different subjects there. At the end, Barry Leroy will present the water and wastewater budgets, and then we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So where we've been so far, this is kind of like a 3-month-long process to get to this point. And in January, we start with some budget meetings between Vince and the Human Resources Director and I, regarding just personnel and what we're planning to budget for personnel, and we put together a list of full-time and regular part-time positions in each department that we're planning to budget, and then on top of that, we budget for some seasonal and other temporary positions as well. Kind of agree on what that's going to be. We put together a personnel budget, and then we basically turn it loose to the departments at that point to submit their budget requests. And after that's done, and during that process, I'm creating a number of other supporting documents that are needed by departments to do their budgets. And then sometime in late February, I get the whole thing, and we start meeting with departments and reviewing what we need to do and finding out where things stand. And of course, the taxable value of the city is a key component of that. Usually, I didn't get the final taxable value until late last week, so that's always somewhat of a guessing game as we go through the process. But next week at your regular city council meeting, you're going to get the budget ordinance, and we'll have the first reading of the budget ordinance, and then the plan is to have the second reading and adoption of it on April 15th. And if we need additional work sessions other than tonight, they can be scheduled. Right now, we don't have any. The main goal is that the budget needs to be adopted by April 30th per the charter. So the process does include review of where we're at with this year's budget. We do review that, and part of what you adopt when you adopt the budget ordinance is an amendment to this year's budget. We hope that it's the last amendment for the year, but as agenda items come up, it may get amended. And we always do a last minute review in June before the fiscal year end to see if anything's not working quite right and amended if necessary at that point. I did email you some documents later on Friday. One of those documents did include a draft budget ordinance. That ordinance is what you adopt to approve millage rates. There's a fee schedule in the back that primarily deals with the water and wastewater utility rates, but there are some other fees in there as well. And there's some other budget operating authorizations within that that you should review. Nothing much has changed there in terms of those. They're the same as last year. The millage rates changed slightly, and we'll go through that here in a second. There's one thing that I'm going to add to it that's not in there right now is when we were reviewing the utility budgets, one of the things that we noted was that specifically in the water department budget, that there's sort of a cash flow issue right now. The water rate model is very complex and there's a lot of moving parts to it, but one of the things that it tries to do is maintain a certain level of operating reserves within that budget. And because we're doing such a large amount of capital projects this year and early into next fiscal year, there was a sort of a cash flow issue that if we didn't do something with it, it would have caused a pretty good spike in rates this coming year. So what we did is to help alleviate that is that there's a loan that the general fund has from the water fund that it received in the past to purchase the property, large piece of open property north of Mason Run, the North Mason Run neighborhood, and the amount is approximately $715,000. So what I'm going to be putting in the ordinance is the approval to pay off that loan from the general fund to the water fund, which will provide the water fund the cash it needs to keep rates at a lower level. Doesn't affect the general fund's fund balance at all. It's really just a swap of cash for another asset, so it won't have really any effect on the general fund, but it will help to reduce and keep the water rates in line. If you recall, in this year's fund balance, we set aside some funds in case somewhere in the future we had to make a tax refund due to the current legislation that's going on regarding the DTE coal plant taxable value. I'm going to add to that ordinance also that we set aside those funds within our fund balance so that it's actually assigned for a specific purpose and not sitting out there for any use whatsoever. So that'll be one addition to it. And there was one blank in the ordinance that you got. It was the LET millage rate. I wanted to confirm that what I had calculated was also what Sam Geitch calculated, and I was able to do that. That's going to be at 0.7711 mils. So that'll be what will be filled in there when you get it on with your agenda.
So part of the general, overview that we put the budget together is obviously there's some framework context for this, and clearly the elephant in the room is the DTE taxable value, both short and long term challenges. So that really gives significant consideration as we are developing the budget, but also, we certainly taken into account the city council goals and objective. Clearly, I think economic development, and in part some of the discussion you had with the DDA and the importance of expanding the tax base is understood. And then the ongoing customer experience, technology innovation initiatives that are undertaking. Some of them across a number of different departments. I know that when we get to talking about water in particular, there's some changes with the meters that we're contemplating. So it's across the board that we look at these different changes. The DTE taxable value, it is approximately 48% of our tax base. A couple years ago, it was $8.4 million. When you looked at what came to the general fund and the refuse fund, last year it was $8.6 million. Their request of 58% would be a $5 million reduction. I mean, for a $20 million budget in the general fund, this is pretty substantial. So, I mean, just to keep it in the context of the significance of the issue, but also we have to look long term. And I think everyone understands. We've had the conversation. I put plant decommissioning, but I think repurposing. Some dialogue with DTE is a lot of the transmission lines are in place, that infrastructure, it wouldn't be the easiest thing for them to walk away, but there is going to get repurposed. And I think in that regard, we still have to take into account what are we going to do with preparing our community for that eventuality. As I've mentioned in the past, we need to address our infrastructure deficiencies here over the next 20 years. Get our services to be operationally and financially sustainable long-term. And obviously, because of, and you'll see a slide later on talking about the impact on public safety. I think property taxes in excess now of 70% of our general fund revenue, and our two largest and our largest source of expenditures is public safety. So we have to keep that in mind when we're developing the budget. Items that are in the budget, we've got funding for the legal challenge, the case before the Michigan Tax Tribunal. I think we've budgeted for our share of that, a little excess of $190,000. As Mr. Sell indicated, we do have a contingency reserve that he's looking to recommend in the ordinance for its adoption. But also at the same time, while we have this challenge, we still want to maintain organizational stability until the case is resolved, so we know where we're going long term. We don't want to lose the economic development momentum that we're experiencing, and so we want to continue to keep that going. And then it allows time for us to develop a public safety short-term and long-term service and staffing plan. As you know, that's currently in the works with the public safety assessment, and at this point in time, they're doing their data analysis and doing that. So probably within a month, we might start talking about dates for another meeting with our consultants. Just a refresher on the city council goals and objective: revitalize neighborhoods, invest in recreational, cultural, historic assets, economic development, continue to support the revitalization of downtown. Again, the one thing I had mentioned, we'll have although not contained in the budget, we do have to have some discussion with some of the funds that are with the building authority and how they may be applied to that goal. Promote community engagement programs. Obviously, there's been some success with Monroe on the Go, and actually Miss Egan sent me a report today that I can probably share with the council with some formats so they get some feedback on the type of I'm not going to say complaints, but items that were contacted regarding that, and even by council member district. And then obviously providing fiscal responsibility while maintaining quality of life, also part of our ongoing. So the economic development, again, downtown development plan implementation, we discussed earlier. Obviously, the last meeting we talked about the Telegraph Corridor and the Lazy Boy site. While I have it in mind, I'm going to retract something I said last week, and I'll just use this as an opportunity. Councilmember Iko Angeli asked if I was considering doing the Lazy Boy sub-area plan to be adopted in the master plan, and I said that's typically what I do. After I thought about it that night, I said, let's once the corridor plan is completed, we'll have that as an adoption, and then have the Lazy Boy as a separate sub-area within that corridor element. So I'm getting off track on the budget, but it is something that I reconsidered after my comment last week. River Raisin National Battlefield Park. I'm going to ask Mark to come up here. There's some good news just to talk about the grant, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit about it, and it's really exciting where we're at now.
Honorable Mayor, Council, Mark Cochran. So we've talked extensively about the Natural Resources Trust Fund grant and the status of where we're at with property acquisition. We've been severely short of the local match requirement, which was about $2 million for the city, for a variety of factors, mostly that the values of the property that we had put up for match did not come in as high as was originally proposed in the grant application. So we've been trying to cobble together, and thanks to the great partnership we have with the Port of Monroe, them donating about 60 acres to the city so far, has helped significantly shore that up. But we still found ourselves about the end of last week beginning of last week, about $650,000 short, and really had no clue how we were going to come up with the rest of that money so that we weren't leaving money on the table that was previously committed to us by the state. So we've been working with our friends at the National Park Trust in Washington, D.C. They've been working with partners that they have here in Michigan, and we had submitted a couple of applications back in December. We got word a couple weeks ago that we're getting $200,000 from the National Park Trust via a local foundation that's going to be announced at the April 5th Battlefield event. So I hope that you can all attend. So that brought us down to about 400 thousand, give or take some. But the other part that the Natural Resources Trust Fund allowed us to do in some of the things that they haven't done with other projects before was commit some previous city-owned property toward the grant with the stipulation that it would be used for public recreational opportunities, and there's a deed restriction that went along with that. That property was the vacant land that's south of the Mineral Multi-Sports Complex. So, you know where the Carn is at Elm and Dixie. It's all of the vacant property that's around there. So, long story short, part of it was previously owned by the Mineral Building Authority as part of the multi-sports complex. Having paid part of the bond off, we were allowed to spin off the vacant property so that the building authority would donate that property to the city, have the deed restriction on there, and then we had to have it appraised in order to get the value to count that as our match. Last week, some of the property values that we've looked at in the Heritage Corridor were about $20,000 an acre. So given the fact that that's about 8 acres, I was estimating that would give us about $176,000, which would still go a pretty long way, but leave us still pretty dramatically short. Well, I got the appraisal report today, and it's $524,000. So I can say that I breathed a big sigh of relief that leaves us short about $21,000 in match. You know, we applied for the FEMA grant, the pre-disaster mitigation, that we've been on and off again with FEMA, but we finally got word that we reached the final milestone, and we expect to hear appraisal pretty soon, or approval pretty soon. And the estimated property value that we're going to acquire through FEMA is about $308,000. So we're doing very well at this point, and we'll be able to utilize all of the funds from the Natural Resources Trust Fund and not have to send it back. So we're going to have about another $2.3 million to spend this summer to continue with property acquisition. So, yeah, it was huge relief.
I will tell you, as when I started here almost 3 years ago, I said this is without a doubt the most complex land acquisition program I've ever seen, and it's now coming to an end. I mean, great work, certainly on the part of Mark, and as he mentioned, the Port Authority, and a lot of people that have just been involved with it. The other part of it is, and Ed reminded me, we had set aside money last year for more demolitions for this program. At the end of this year, we're forecasting a modest increase of which we would put in there. So we probably have in excess of about $450,000 I think we could go toward demolition. The point of it is this phase of the land acquisition, demolition, I think we're set to go. Really a significant step toward this economic development program. Not to mention, we'll talk a little bit later about the education center. I kind of still call it the Monroe Multi-Sports Complex, but that's had a positive effect, the lease agreement as well on our operating budget. But all in all, I think it was that was about as good a news as I could have when Mark was sharing that for me. So, but that's why I wanted to share it with the council.
Excellent. Thank you.
If I may just add a couple more things. The benefit of the FEMA grant is, of course, that covers the demolition. The Natural Resources Trust Fund does not. So everything is fully paid for with the FEMA grant. For the Natural Resources Trust Fund, I expect that we're going to be able to buy about another 12 to 18 more properties with the funding that we got approved, hopefully by the DNR this week. And so when we look at, it's about $178,000 average that we've been spending to acquire properties. And so to demolish those, it's going to be about $351,000 is what I estimate. So if we put the $450,000 in the budget, or $400,000 for demolition, I think we're going to be okay. So to add a couple more points, now the project, we have to really strategize of what properties we want to target. Vince asked me before I came up how many properties are left on Elm. That's been our top priority, because if you look at the Heritage Corridor Plan, the economic impact model does say that the biggest impact is going to be the recreation of historic Frenchtown and the education center. So we're going to prioritize all the property along Elm. There's about 10 properties that are left on Elm. One of those we're going to pick up in the FEMA grant. 2 of those we don't plan on picking up at all in the near future. So prioritizing Elm Avenue, and then 4 properties on the south side of the river along Front Street near Hellenberg are going to be the top priorities. So assuming willing sellers.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
So, a couple other economic development items. Monroe Link implementation. We'll be talking a little bit about aspects of here in the next month with the freeway interchanges. Neighborhood improvements. I know that certainly has come up for discussion recently. And then partnerships similar to what the dialogue we've had with Frenchtown regarding the Lazy Boy site with that we'll continue to pursue. Customer experience, technology, ongoing programming that we're going to continue to do, some process mapping. We do, I can never remember the official title of Terry's position.
Business Intelligence and Data Coordinator.
Yes.
Just got to say it repeatedly.
But we now have that individual as part of our staff, and certainly looking to, we've got, in fact, I think interviews are scheduled next week for the GIS position. So we're really kind of rolling pretty good now with that aspect of our strategic plan. 3-year budget, again, we carry out the projects we project out for the next couple of years beyond that. Obviously, we want to develop reasonable budgets in light of DTE tax appeal, maintain existing millage rates. There's a slight modification, very small, but we'll go through that later on another slide. And don't engage in long-term deficit spending, follow city financial policies, maintain our healthy fund balances, maintain infrastructure investment, and certainly maintain and try and improve our city services where we can. And so with that, I'm going to let Ed kind of go into a lot of the details regarding the financial overview, and every once in a while I'll pipe in and offer a couple of words. So, Ed?
Okay, well, we'll get into this a little more in detail as I get into the revenue section here, but we are projecting a modest growth in revenue. Most of our major revenue sources, about 2% in property taxes, about 2% in revenue sharing are the big items. We're actually seeing, for the first time in a long time, some substantial investment income, so that helps things out a little bit. Fund balances for all the primary funds are adequate. We'll go through those as we go along here. We're doing well as far as pension and retiree health care funding. We're not on any of the state's naughty lists, so we're good there. We don't have to submit waiver plans or anything like that. We're monitoring the building safety fund closely. That's the fund that accounts for basically our building all of our trade inspections, I should say. And as well as our rental inspection program. It ended with a very small fund balance last year, so talk a little bit more about that. Water, wastewater rates, Barry's going to get into that. There are some recommended increases in those, but he's got a pretty thorough analysis that he's going to go through, so I'm not going to touch on that too much. And we do have one of the new things that's in the budget this year is we've budgeted for each employee, except for police and fire, because they already have uniform fundings in their budget. Some clothing, branded clothing funding. It's basically about $200 per employee. For some of the employees that do work outside in the winter and need winter coats, there's an additional amount for those people. But we also budgeted for, in last year's, not this year's CIP, but the 18-19 capital improvement program, we budgeted $50,000 for branding improvements, basically branding signs as well. So that is still out there to be spent as well. So that's still ongoing. Just me or you?
Both of us. I'll take a shot at it. The DTE, the future concerns, obviously, the taxable value and the MTT case is ongoing. There's always some concern, with the volatility of the economy. It's been bouncing a little bit. Pension assumptions are changing. You know, we are currently reducing our rate of return over a 5-year period. I think we're into the 3rd year now. We got 2 more years where we're taking them down 5 basis points. And again, I think at the end we'll have a rate of return at the end of that of 7.25, which is pretty reasonable. And then we probably, as a pension board, may talk about even carrying it down as low as 7. I think it's a very, very conservative approach, and I think that's probably appropriate. Always concerned about federal budget reductions, in particular with our largest program, CDBG. I am going to say we struggle with inadequate infrastructure funding, and specifically our residential streets, sidewalks, parks, and facilities. And at some point in time, you know, we may have to contemplate a dedicated millage for some of this. I say that, you know, the governor has proposed a pretty aggressive gas tax increase, but a lot of that is going to go to state roads and major trunk lines, not a lot using the Act 51 formula. That being the case, you know, we may be on our own. I will hesitate and say not to consider it this year. I think it would probably not be prudent until we know the outcome of the DTE case. Again, we've got $1.5 million that we're setting aside. If things came back more favorably, then you could contemplate applying that toward this inadequate infrastructure funding that we have. The funding need for property acquisitions and demolitions, again, I think the importance of buying some of these properties like we have this last year and demolishing the homes that have been beyond repair. I think it helps toward blight elimination and certainly improving the neighborhoods themselves. And then Ed will talk a little bit about the operating funds, the building safety, airport, and stores and equipment fund. And I don't have it in here, but we probably have to have a discussion about the need for a lobbyist, particularly for grant funding and various regulations that may affect us. I will tell you that, you know, we've struggled, I shouldn't say struggled, but have been frustrated with certain things that with some of the agencies we have. And as we talk about the freeway interchange and working with MDOT to try and accomplish something that is outside of the typical framework of the bureaucracy that they have to follow, may require some assistance to break through on that. You know, we really want to employ and pursue a kind of an entrepreneurial approach, but, you know, sometimes it's finding the right conversations with the right people, so.
Was the intention to contract to a firm for that service or to hire direct?
I would contract for that, yeah. We still need to have a conversation, but it's not in the proposed budget. I really wanted to put that in there, but I, at the end, did not.
Yeah, how many other cities and municipalities in Michigan do such a thing? I mean, are there quite a few or not?
Not a lot, but there's a handful.
Okay. It might be an opportunity for us, what I'm thinking.
I think it is. In light of some of the projects that we have out there, that I think having that kind of assistance will pay significant dividends for a handful of these. And some of them we've even talked at the federal level about some grants potentially as well related to the national park and other projects out there. So I will tell you, when I worked in Florida a few years ago, we had one in, you know, it was probably a 10-fold return based on what we were paying for. And in some cases, we used them even for some regulatory purposes, where one of our case, we were having our NPDES permit with the state there, and through their efforts, we're able to, you know, find a reasonable solution. So I throw that out there. It's not in the budget, but I put it in bold for a reason. I really, really think we need to give this some serious consideration. So,
okay.
Good.
The details of kind of what's in the budget itself in terms of costs and revenues and so on. And we'll start out with personnel. Personnel is the #1 cost in the general fund, or pretty much all the budgets for that matter. So we fund health insurance for our full-time employees. All groups are PA 152 hard cap compliant, which means the law the state passed back in 2012 that sets certain caps in terms of what you can spend on primarily medical and prescription insurance for employees. And so we're staying under those caps at this point. We did this last year, get really close to going over them, but we have remained under them since they've come in place. In the budget, I did budget a 5% increase over the current premium level, so that's what's included in the budget, 3% for dental. Post-retirement health care, we had an actuarial study done as of 12/31/2016, and that study recommended a contribution to the fund of $1.297 million for the fiscal year that's coming up. ADC is actuarially determined contribution. In the budget, we have $1.125 million budgeted, and that includes $200,000 from our Medicare Part D reimbursements. We're a little under that, but also at the same time are looking at costs. And I know Vince has talked about the Medicare Part D or Medicare Advantage program that we've been looking at. So we're looking at ways to reduce costs at the same time. The OPEB bond payment is, we issued bonds to fund a good portion of the liability the city has there, and that next year will be $2.32 million. So you add those two together, that's kind of the city's cost next year is about $3.4 million. Our claims, as estimated by the actuary, are about $5.09 million. So you can see because we funded the trust, we're not having to fund that on a pay-as-you-go basis at this point. That's that plus a reduced contribution is the savings from issuing OPEB bonds. The system itself is 84.7% funded, and the total actuarial accrued liability is $67.48 million for that system. As far as the pension system goes, our total contribution next year is going to be $2.01 million. Prior year it was $1.8 million, so it did increase about 11%. That was a little bit of a surprise to us, but it is included in the budget. The pension contribution, as compared to the retiree health care contribution, is required to be funded per the state constitution. So there is a little bit of a difference there, but so it is legally required to be funded. The general fund portion of that $2 million is 1.637. These new fonts, I can sometimes never tell the difference between a 3 and a 5. But anyway, 1.637 million. The plan as a whole is 91.4% funded, and Vince mentioned the assumption changes that are going on. So as far as personnel, there's no real increases in full-time staffing. There has been some restructuring that I think you're aware of in the clerk treasurer's office, the building department, engineering. Those are all budgeted in here. There's no changes in the public safety budget. We're waiting completion of the public safety assessment before we do anything there. There are a couple part-time positions in the utilities, both wastewater and water, that Barry's actually going to talk about there. HEO is heavy equipment operator in wastewater, and in water, they're help with their cross-connection program, and also their lead copper rules, and then also they're talking about going to monthly billing, so they need some additional administrative help with that. So the total full-time and regular part-time positions budgeted is 180.92. So compared to, and you see some numbers that's compared to in the past. Way back when in fiscal year 05, we were at 250. Wage increases.
Ed?
Yeah. Question? Somebody?
The question actually was about healthcare premiums, and if you had heard anything from the bargaining units about that. I mean, if we're anticipating to hit cap year over year, I mean, I know this affects you too, but are you hearing or do you anticipate any mumblings from them?
If we get there, yes. I mean, it'll affect that. It hasn't affected.
Because right now I'm not really worried because they kind of understand the position that we're in, but
right.
I just don't want to hit them over the head with it every single year.
Yeah. Like I said, we've been in this for 7-8 years now, and it hasn't affected them that way yet. So there hasn't been any discussion about it really. But it just kind of got to see what our renewal is going to look like for next year, and then we can have those discussions if we need to.
Okay.
And I guess the way it works, I mean, it does flow back to the employee, the way our system works. If, you know, if we hit the caps, then the city can pay less in terms of what we contribute to health savings accounts, and we have 3 plans. The city makes contributions to health savings accounts in one of the plans, and the employees contribute biweekly in their paychecks to the other 2 plans, so they would be contributing more for those plans if they selected those plans, and that's what would happen is, you know, those are the adjustments we'd make first. Wage increases. Everybody's got a bargaining agreement in place or through July 1st, 2019. Basically, everybody's budgeted for a 2% wage increase, and if they're still moving through their wage scale, they'll also be getting step increases in those scales, and all those would go into effect on July 1st. Some of the seasonal and temporary employees budgeted are listed there. Elections assistants for the clerk treasurer, an intern for engineering. DPS has got some forestry assistants, misdig help, and other miscellaneous work, operations type work. Airport, they've got line service workers. Building increases their part-time blight inspector to full-time in the summer. It's kind of like May through early October. Recreation has seasonal part-time help, and the programs, of course, they have all their employees that run the various recreation programs. And then Parks Maintenance hires employees to work in the parks doing maintenance type activities throughout the summer. The capital improvements program, you adopted that back in February. The whole program is included in this budget. And you know, last week you approved a utilities program that actually starts basically in April. So some of those items actually move forward into the 18-19 fiscal year. But whether they're funded this year or next year, they're all in the budget in one form or another. $2.98 million was in there for street projects. About $3.5 million was in there for utility projects. We've got $676,000 in funding for DPS equipment. Long list there. I can get you a list of that if you'd like. But the big issue there was some of their heavy equipment. We've got a couple bigger trucks, and I'll get to that when we get to the stores fund. The roof replacement at DPS is budgeted, labor park, master plan implementation, and some other smaller projects. Some other things that are in the budget still or new, the Business Development Corporation agreement is continuing on. The fire station millage, when we first levied that, we weren't quite sure whether we were going to use those funds to pay for the construction costs or if we were going to issue debt and then have the millage money pay the debt payments, or a combination of the two. In the end, what we've done is we've issued debt, and the millage money is primarily going to make the payments on the bond issue. So what I did is I created a separate debt service fund, which we'll go over a little bit later in the presentation. But basically the millage money will go directly into that debt service fund, and then the debt payments will be made out of there, and anything extra there is available for what was denoted in the millage language, which is constructing and equipping a central fire station. So just because it goes in there doesn't mean it has to be used for the debt, is I guess what I'm trying to say with that. It can be used for other purposes that were allowed for in the millage. Legal and consultant fees, we do have $190,000 budgeted for that specific purpose. The police department is participating in a county-wide record management system software replacement. The county has offered really favorable financing terms, so we are financing that over a 3-year period, 2% interest. So there's about $31,000 budgeted each year for debt service on that. The police department is also investing in a new body cam and vehicle cam system, so that is included in this budget as well. Fire basically continuing the turnout gear replacement program. They're continuing their equipment replacement. We do have $30,000 budgeted within the fire budget for that. There are some, I would say, minor increases in the fire department budget for new supplies and equipment for the new fire station. Some of those could come out, they're mostly supplies, but some of those could actually come out of the millage, and that's something we can consider when we get there. The demolition budget, this year we started out with $75,000 budgeted, and in next year's budget that's been increased to $125,000. Something that I think I have it later on here, but as part of the budget process, we were kind of coming up with a little bit of extra money in this year's budget, and that money, about $85,000, has been applied to demolitions related to the trust fund grant program.
And if I may just follow up on that, again, Mr. Green assembled a group with police, fire, the building department, looking at a number of our residential homes that probably are in need of being demolished, and they came up with an estimate of $200,000. I sat in it, so I will tell you this is not where I'd like it to be, but the number to try and hit is $200,000. So as Mr. Sell said at the end of the year, we're going to recommend putting some of that money into demolition for completion of the battlefield acquisition and/or supplement some of this if we can. So the other thing with it is the Saks Furniture building. We broached the request to the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority about a possible grant in the neighborhood of $200,000 to bring that building down over on First Street. It's been there, and it's becoming, more from a blighted standpoint to maybe more of a health hazard. So we just think that we're at a point where we need to be a little more aggressive with that. So.
This year, when we kind of crossed fiscal years, we carried $100,000 over into the demolition budget this year. So we're actually, where we started out at $75,000 this year, we're actually ended up being at $175,000. So as we get closer to fiscal year end, we'll look at how things are looking, and there's still some things that have to happen this fiscal year that we don't know about that hopefully will be good, but we'll wait and see. So we're going to continue on with customer service improvements and programming, and then there's various large maintenance projects budgeted within the parks maintenance program. For example, roof replacement of the band shell at St. Mary's Park is one of them. Battlefield Education Center, roughly, the whole budget there's $80,000 budgeted for operation and maintenance of the facility. That's related to our requirements under the lease now, and so that's what's there. In the past, when we were operating as a multi-sports complex and approaching $200,000 in subsidies, and then we're now down to $80,000 to operate the facility. So there's definitely been a reduction in costs there. The ALCC grant continues as it is this year, $140,000 in funding, and also $16,000 for utilities. There's funding in the Stores and Equipment Fund for 2 large truck replacements, both what are called swap loaders, meaning they can work as dump trucks or flatbed trucks. So that's been included in that budget. A little bit more on where that fund stands in the future here. I think we talked about battlefield property. Inspection fees, we just increased those as of July 1st. So there's no recommendation in here to do anything with those at this point. We just need some more time to evaluate how they're going and what the volume of inspections has been since then. I think the first 6 months was good, but then obviously in the winter things did slow down a bit. So we need some more time to evaluate where things are at with that. And then, as you all know, the school has said that they want their fiber back that we've been using to connect our computer network to our remote buildings. And also we need to run fiber to our new fire station. So at this time that hasn't been budgeted because we're going through a design process at this point, and the cost it's just not known yet. But the plan for that is to probably finance that and fund it over a number of years. But again, that depends on what we find out as the projected cost of that will be. And so we expect to have that designed within the next month, basically at this point. There's some other IT things here, a new storage array. That's basically, we have a big server in our IT room that stores all our files. It's pretty old at this point, so IT is saying we should replace it next year. A very high estimate of $50,000. We have a folder inserter machine upstairs that basically takes all our utility bills, and some other, like, other departments use it as well, but its main purpose originally was for folding and inserting utility bills for the mailing process. As part of potentially going monthly with our billing process, we'll definitely need to replace that, so that's budgeted. And network storage for the police body and vehicle cams that I mentioned. We're going to need more storage to store their video for those. That's budgeted in the IT fund. Some network equipment for the new fire station, and we're looking to expand wireless access to a couple additional city buildings, including the police station and Department of Public Services. So now some information about the numbers here. This is just a breakdown of the revenues, very, very summarized in terms of where we're at in terms of the general fund budget at this point. So the 2018-19 budget is where we stand, is the fiscal year we're currently in. That's the first column. And I will say that including that capital grant line, third from the bottom, I guess, that includes the Michigan, the DNR Trust Fund grant. So that causes this year's revenue to be a little bit higher. Basically, we have the whole thing budgeted, and we won't receive the whole thing this year, but that's kind of how we have to budget for it. So this year we're at 23.2 million, but if you took out that grant, we'd be around 20.5. So next year's revenue, 2019-20, is about 20.6, and then you see the increases in the following years to 20.8 and 21.3. And you can see the very top line there, property taxes by far is the largest amount. And this slide then shows that graphically. The blue amount there, what this is doing is taking those numbers and showing what portion of them or what of those categories make up which portion. The blue amount is the property tax revenue, and the kind of burgundy color on my screen is state revenue sharing. So those are by far our biggest revenue numbers for the general fund. And then just to break that down a little further, listed on the left there are various property tax, or various revenue categories. And you can see if you just focus on the 2019-20 requested budget column there on the right, you can see how much they're budgeted for and then what percentage of the total budget they make up. So you see property taxes is 14.6 million. That's almost 71% of the revenue budget. Personal property tax reimbursement and state revenue sharing, as far as financial reporting, are both considered revenue sharing. That's another 5% or so. So you can see the items there, and all those items together make up 87% of our revenue budget in the general fund. So as far as our tax revenue, the total taxable value, I always compare it to where we were at this time last year when we were adopting the budget to where we're at this year when we're adopting the budget, and that went up about 2.08%. The DTE plant is included in there, and that includes a CPI increase of 2.4%. Revenue sharing, if you were to go on the Department of Treasury's website, they'll give you a projection of where we're going to be at this year. So that's what we have budgeted for this fiscal year. And then we have 2% budgeted, 2% increases budgeted in subsequent years. There's been a lot of talk about revenue sharing and what's going to happen with that, but until the state gets through the budget, we just can't count on it one way or another. And then our personal property tax reimbursement, what I've got budgeted there in the out years is really the statutory calculation. They changed the procedure a little bit last year, where by now we would have known in the past we would have known if we were getting any extra money, like if there was any extra money in the pot for them to distribute. Now they don't do that until May. So we're estimating or hoping for an additional $450,000 this year, which is to fund the St. Mary's Garden storm sewer capital improvement project. We won't know until May whether we get that, and that's why, if you remember, in the CIP that was marked as conditional funding. So We do know we're going to get extra funding, but we do not know how much that will be yet. As an example, in fiscal year 17-18 in total, the general fund received about $1.2 million in personal property tax reimbursement funding. So if we're along the same lines, well, we are going to get some more. I just don't know how much yet. Franchise fees, we actually budgeted a slight decrease last year because that's the way things were trending this year. It has actually increased slightly. So we're budgeting at this year's levels, but flat across the board. About $330,000 is what we project for that. And the remaining trust fund grant is budgeted in this fiscal year. Whatever doesn't happen this year will be carried forward to future fiscal years. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Save My City project, savemycity.org, but if you were to go on savemycity.org, basically what it says is the amount of the revenue sharing the city has lost since 2002 is about $10.8 million. And to take that a little further, if you look at this graph, the top blue line there is the total revenue sharing, and the dark blue line is where the city would have been if the state would have fully funded the formula that was in place back in 2002 through today. So we would have been at that top blue line, but instead, because of cuts in statutory revenue sharing by the state legislature, we were at that bottom lighter blue line. So you can see in 2017, that's about $1 million gap. And that's where you get to that $10.8 million. So if we had an extra $1 million in our budget, there would be a lot more money for road projects, park projects, etc.
If I may just pile on with it, it is, I mean, you'll see language that Michigan has really disinvested in its local units of government like no other state has. And if you look at some of the amount of revenue sharing that other states have committed locally, and, you know, we're still less than what we received in 2005. Again, just contemplate if you had another $1 million a year to put toward capital projects. It's in some ways, it's very tragic, the disinvestment that has taken place. And, you know, essentially having, you know, the communities balance the state budget in many ways, so.
Yeah, that bottom section is just the statutory. When we get revenue sharing, part of it we receive because it's required by the Constitution. Part of it we receive because the legislature budgets it. That bottom section, the green part there, is the difference in the formula related to statutory revenue sharing, and so that's why, you know, the gap between the green at the bottom and the blue at the top is about the same, because all the cuts have come in statutory revenue sharing. This slide is just put together to show you the millage rates that are going to be recommended in the change between years. So you can see in fiscal year 2019, we were at 3372 mills. In fiscal year 20, it's going to be recommended at 17.3592. So it's an increase in total of 0.022, most of that being a small increase in the refuse millage. And I'll go a little bit into the refuse fund as we go on here. The economic development one is actually decreased because we're capped at being able to generate $50,000 in revenue from that millage. So as taxable value goes up, the millage rate has to come down a little bit. Now we'll get into the expenditures just a little bit here, and this is a similar slide to what I showed on revenue. It just breaks down the city's expenditures by function, and there are 5 columns here. The first column is what the budget currently stands at for the general fund, and then the second column is what you're being asked to amend it to, $23.291 million. And then you've got the 2019-20 requested budget is what you're being requested to adopt for next year, and you've got 2 years of projections out past that. As we talked before, the second line in there is public safety. That's the largest line there. Probably general government is the next biggest, but we'll go through that a little bit here in terms of what makes up what in there. But in terms of the expenditure amounts, that's what's being requested at this point and projected. And this again just breaks that down graphically. The red part being public safety, the lighter blue part at the bottom being general government. So that's just showing graphically what functions make up the biggest part of the general fund expenditures. This is another slide that takes those same expenditure amounts and just breaks it down by sort of activity. So you've got, or classification. Personnel is the top line there, and you can see that by far makes up the top or the largest amount of the expenditures. You've got some other operating items there that are the next largest amount. So all those things together then match that previous slide in terms of the totals.
Andrew?
Could we go back a couple of slides?
Sure.
Back where it listed out general government, and it was either 2021 or 2021-22.
Okay.
Yeah, 2021-22 from the previous year, you're anticipating $100,000 reduction in cost despite a presumably anticipated 2% increase in payroll. Does that incorporate some restructuring of departments, or what's going on there?
I think the easiest explanation may be the fact that we are not looking at the $191,000 that we're putting out there for the DTE case. I mean, we budgeted for 3 years. This upcoming budget year is the second year. The third year would be 2021. Drop that number off in the last column, and that's pretty much, I think.
Because that issue should then be resolved.
We
It's
hope
the
so.
Anticipation. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
All right.
That's true.
Thank you.
I was coming up blank.
We're here to help each other.
So I guess while we're on that, I was just looking at a couple others, and you probably already said it, but looking at the next one, public safety, and going into this upcoming budget year, a drop, and then it returns back. Is there an item related to that? Or just...
A major expenditure or outlay that we have for
This year includes the public safety assessment.
that's part of it. It's
Cross
100
is
there.
in there.
Yeah.
It's not a measure so much as the drop, it's what we were putting in the current budget year.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
okay. All right.
I know that's one-time
Are we-
item that's in there.
Anything with the vehicle purchases?
Not really,
Okay.
no. I mean, there are a little bit higher equipment costs this year as
Yeah.
well, so that.
That may account for it.
Those are probably the two things that I can think off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
I can look into that and see if there's something else there that stands out.
It makes sense. Assessment will be coming to a conclusion, but then we'll see what we get from that and what decisions we may need to make at that point.
Right.
Brian?
Yeah, not only that, but you also have the purchase of that new system that they're going to implement, correct? It's like $100,000.
Yeah,
the
that's in
county?
next year's budget, though.
That's
so-
in next year's budget. Oh, so that doesn't make a lot of sense then. Makes it even worse.
Yeah, it does. I can look into
Yeah,
it.
well-
It just it's something when you see a change, and it makes sense to me of expenditures really of this fiscal year versus that much of a greater reduction for next year. Okay, I'm good.
Oh,
Oh,
just one more
Andrew?
item on specifically public safety. This is funding at current levels. So whatever the result of the operational assessment, that would be an amendment to the budget at that point, if there
Yes.
were going to be any changes.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, I think we were here. I think we've covered that. Okay, so we're on to this slide, and this, again, just breaks down the different major categories of expenditures that are budgeted. And mine's shrunk so much I can barely see it. But that top line there is $1.855 million in personnel costs. So that's about 57% of your expenditures. That's netted out for what we charge back to other funds like the street funds and things like that for services that are provided to them. But then you got the other major categories there. We'll go through all of them individually. Rentals is the Stores and Equipment Fund charges rentals of its equipment back to the departments. So that's part of that, but also the multi-sports complex bond payment is considered a rental as well. That's about $430,000 of that. street lighting, the funding for the Port of Monroe. We do have $1.6 million in contingency included there, with $1.5 million of that being related to future potential funding needed for tax refunds. And then some other items there at the end, debt service being $1.75 million. So all those items together make up 94% of the general fund budget. And this is a really, really summarized look of where the general fund is at, primarily to show you two things: how the revenue versus expense plays out each year, but then also to show you where fund balance is for the general fund in total. Our financial policies say we try to keep a minimum of 15% in fund balance. And so that's what the goal we're trying to hit with that second to bottom line there. So what you see is, starting from the left, is where we're at with the current budget, amended budget, is we're having revenue slightly over expense by about $1,100. The projected budget for 2018-19 is flat with zero surplus or deficit there. But in the out years, 1920, 2021, 21-22, there is a small amount of expenditures in excess of revenues. And in 1920 and 2021, that's primarily due to the $190,000 we have budgeted for the legal fees. 21-22, it's a pretty small amount, not concerned about that. So if you take those amounts into account, you've got your fund balance numbers there. And if you look at the 2018-19 projected activity column in the beginning fund balance line, 4.32 million, that's where we ended last fiscal year with the general fund balance. And so by applying the amounts in the revenue over under line to that over the years, you get to $3.9 million by the end of 21-22 if everything worked out just like this. So that would leave us with 18.27% in fund balance. And when you add in the city's budget stabilization fund, which is $2 million, we actually have approximately 27% in reserves, which is a very healthy amount. Some of the items that are in there, of course, we've beat that first one up, I think, pretty good. The labor attorney, is $30,000 is budgeted for that. Contingency we've talked about. The debt addition for the police software, we talked about that. The multi-sports complex debt is really being paid from funds we had set aside in prior years from excess personal property tax reimbursements, and there's $845,000 budgeted for capital next year.
I have a question maybe for Vince. I know that, I think you mentioned it, but I just can't remember the date you said regarding the work that was done here in the past, getting the labor contracts all together, I think in the same year. They extend until
2020.
2020.
Okay, next a year plus from now. Okay.
So the other thing is, look at the labor attorney. I
Right.
think a few years ago we were spending about $60,000 a year, and so council granted me some latitude to, continue working with Dykema Gossick, and but we handle a lot more stuff internally and resolve it, and just use them on specialized related items. So.
Okay. Oh, Andrew.
3 questions for Vince and Ed. So all said, you feel comfortable with the DTE reserves that we've set aside?
It's what, 20%. Ed was, we were talking this afternoon. It's a little over 20%.
About 20, I'd say.
What's that?
About 20, yeah.
Yeah, 20%. If there was a 20% reduction, we got it covered. If it's beyond that, it's at that point.
Because those were numbers that were based off some of the initial estimations, and when the actual request came through, it turned out to be much more than we anticipated. I mean, at this point, it's like a third of what's being asked for. So I just want to make sure that you feel comfortable with the amount that's being set aside.
I think it's the best that we can do. And I say that in all sincerity, is that it could come in substantially more, it could come in substantially less. It really is a function of how the case is heard and the determination of the administrative judges with the case. It can go anywhere. I really don't know. it's that uncertain.
Yeah, and we never tried to get to the full funding of that amount in
Yeah.
the budget. You know, last year our goal was to maybe get to 25% of it. And,
Right.
you know, but that last year, if you remember, meant we weren't going to fill some police
Mm-hmm.
and fire positions, and those were put back in. So that's how we really got down to about a 20% amount, and that's where we're basically trying to continue it this year going forward.
Well, we don't think that that's too naive. And we don't think that that's just wishful thinking or anything.
On our case,
Yeah.
with the 20, you know, I think it's how should I say this? It is really the best that we could set aside and still continue the operations. If hypothetically it came back that the judgment was the full 58% reduction they asked for, I can tell you that your operations will never look like they have before. And in the short run, what it would mean is we'd probably issue what's called judgment bonds to help defray that off, that payback over a period of 10 years. But the operations themselves would be so fundamentally altered. You would just have to deal with what that outcome was if they were to be granted that full amount of appeal that they're requesting. It's as simple as that. On the other hand, if it's substantially less, you've got the $1.5 million less, whatever that reduction is, to apply toward capital improvements. The alternative is if you try to get that number, you would be substantially reducing, primarily in the public safety realm, substantially to get and cover the 58%. I mean, that's still another, roughly $3 million that you'd have to come up with in the general fund, and that would be phenomenal impact on operations.
Sure.
So,
And I'm not like asking, why aren't we setting aside $5
No,
million
no, I think
every
it's
year?
good.
I understand that we're speaking at the margins here. I want to make sure that some discomfort now isn't going to save us some real pain later. And you're saying the discomfort now really wouldn't make a difference.
if it came back at 58, it would have as I said, such a profound effect on everything from our infrastructure investment to our mostly public safety services. It's one of those things that you can't budget for a catastrophe, but that's literally what it would be, is a catastrophe.
Okay.
So we think this is a reasonable amount. We obviously like to think our position is strong, and we feel that way, but anytime you get into any kind of court or quasi-judicial process, you never know necessarily how that's going to come out. So it really is in many ways, and very simple, the best what we can put aside for that possibility.
Second but similar question. Some reports of inverted yield curves coming out recently. When we had a recession that was over 10 years ago, I'm not saying that we're due for another one, but the economy is not doing what people thought it was going to do. I think it's going to be fine in the near to mid future, but in the cases that it's not, we have a marginally deflated fund balance. Looking 2-3 years from now, do we feel comfortable with that as well, considering any potential for economic downturn?
Well, I think the Fed, can you flip back to that one chart that shows the percent of revenues? I think it's a couple more. The one, we're almost there. Did I already pass it?
No, I think
There it is. This one here, and one of the reasons I like this, and I've used it in a number of different jurisdictions where I've been manager, is that with probably 10 line items, you got 95% of your budget in the general fund. The other thing with it is that we know pretty, with a degree of certainty that $14,600,000 is a pretty good number for the next year. So there's always going to be a lag between when the economic activity hits and where, how it affects our general fund. So we're okay for another year. The only risk, obviously, is the DTE case. But by and large, most of the time, it's pretty predictable with these revenues. And so if there is an economic downturn, it's going to hit us in the next 2 years thereafter, more than likely, so.
Number 3 is the 350,000, I think it was 350,000 that was set aside for the franchise fees. That maintains the 50/50.
330,000.
330,000, that maintains the 50/50 share between us and cable access.
338,000 is what we're projecting to receive from the cable companies. So 50% of that is then budgeted to be paid to Impact. Yes.
Okay.
I think that's what you're asking, right?
I guess in the budget maintains that level,
Yes.
at least how it is now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Even though there's, certain discussions in Washington at the
Yeah, and that's
FCC
kinda
of
what that's
eviscerating
leading
that, those franchise fees, we've got it built in, and if it happens, then we will obviously have to deal with that as well. But I was surprised they're actually holding stable. They were declining for a period of time, and but that eventuality exists based on some of the discussion with the FCC in Washington right now. So where it ends, I don't know. I am concerned, though.
Well, you saw where it was going. I just think if
Yep.
something happens, it is important for us to react. It's
Absolutely.
unfortunate that has to be our burden, but I think it has to be somebody's, and no one else seems to be stepping up.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Nope.
All right. So included also in the fiscal year 18-19 budget, and I'll probably get into this a little bit more when I talk about the building safety fund itself, but there's 20,000 budgeted in case the revenues of the building safety fund aren't substantial enough to cover its operations. So that there's a subsidy there, and also a continued subsidy for the airport fund of $43,000 in fiscal year 19-20. So we're going to get into some of the non-general fund budgets now. Major street fund is, we do cover the cost of maintenance and improvements to our major type streets. All those CIP programs that were approved in the CIP plan are funded. We look at this when we were doing the CIP, we look at the street funds over a 5-year period to determine how much funding we think we have to do capital projects. This budget, of course, looks at it over a 3-year period. So if our projections work out over the next 3 years as we've planned them, the major street fund would have about $494,000 still in it in reserve as of June 30th, 2022. Because of potential contingencies that are out there, we usually try to keep about $400,000 in that fund. Of the Act 51 money that we receive from the state, 13% is budgeted to be sent to the local street fund. And we did get some additional state appropriations this year, 75% of that. The state doesn't really tell us how much you put in major versus local streets. We put 75% of that in the major street fund. This is what it looks like just in terms of the numbers. The total estimated revenues you see each line there is varies from year to year depending on what kind of state or federal funding we're getting. But you're looking at around anywhere from 1.9 up to $2.4 million this year. We just never know whether there's going to be a supplemental coming through. We are advance funding 1 year's federal funds, so that's why you don't see one in the 2020-21 year there. So that's why there's a difference there. And then the appropriations, again, vary from year to year based on what we're projecting, but you can see in the second to bottom line in the very first column there, we ended last fiscal year with about $1 million in fund balance in the major street fund. And then with these projections and budgets here, see we're spending about projected to spend about $541,000 next year. That's how it works its way down to $494,000 by the end of the 3-year period. Local street fund, same type of fund, just for the more neighborhood type local streets. All 2020 CIP funding is included. Again, the fund balance at the end of the 3-year period is estimated to be $162,000, and 25% of those state funds, additional state funds, went into this fund. Same type of analysis here as with the previous fund. Ended last fiscal year with a fund balance of $777,000. And over the 3-year period, you can see we're spending about $705,000 of that, or at least projected to spend $705,000 of that next fiscal year. And over the 3-year period, we get down to about $162,000. That's, we're spending that money on capital improvements and road improvements, so that's a good thing. The refuse fund. This fund is funded by the refuse millage itself, and next year it's being recommended to increase it to 1.655 mils. This year it was at 1.632. The estimated ending fund balance at the end of the 3-year period is about $94,000. Our goal with this fund, because it is a pretty stable funding source and the costs are pretty stable, is to keep a minimum of 5% of expenditures in fund balance. 94,000 is about 5.1%, so that meets the goal. And I will say that there's things that happen here. We don't always spend everything we budget. We'll probably get some additional personal property tax reimbursement money into this fund that we're not planning on right now. So that's why I don't go further than trying to get more than 5% in there, because by doing that, basically you're increasing the millage rate for what may be unnecessary. We are funding the new DPS Vector financing from this fund, and the services provided out of here are street sweeping, catch basin cleaning, refuse and recyclables removal, and leaf bags. Again, this is another look at how that fund lays out. Last year when I did this presentation, by the end of the 3rd year, we were going to get down to about 3% in fund balance, but we didn't increase the millage because, like I said, things happen that make things turn out better than we expected a lot of times. So what this is showing is that at the end of the last fiscal year, 2018, we had $341,000 in fund balance. And with this budget projection, by the end, it would get down to about $94,000. So obviously, if we wanted to try to keep that at $341,000, which isn't necessary, we'd have to raise the millage rate. So it's just something we monitor year after year and make sure we're not getting into deficit positions with the fund.
What's the next slide?
Building safety fund.
Okay, let me, with the refuse fund, there's 2 issues that are contained in the budget. And I haven't shared with council, but we've got a kind of a dispute right now with Waste Management regarding the number of customers. And so, Mr. Lewis and the representative with Waste Management have been going back and forth. But it would, excuse me, add a pretty substantial increase in the number of units that would part of the calculation with that. And so we've built the budget on a worst case scenario, but we still have some discussion with them to take place. And, as a little more details with that come forth, I'll obviously share it with the city council. But, there is a sense that they think that there should be more number of units that they're picking up than what they have historically. And so we're a little shocked that they're bringing it up at this point in time, since they've had the contract for almost 10 years. But be that as it may, I'll share that with council as we continue the dialogue with them. So the other part of it is, and it's probably no mystery, is the recycling industry is just in a complete state of flux. And about 3 months ago, Waste Management conducted an audit of our recycling material. I'll probably look to Patrick. I think our contract requires, an 8% waste, if you will, or, something that doesn't meet, it came back at 17. And so they sent that to us. They haven't asked anything else, but there was a calculation contained in there. And if my recollection serves right, we probably put about another $8,000 in there for a surcharge between the 8% and 17%. So I can't remember. I want to say waste, but non-compliant type of material that's going there. So part of it is that give us an opportunity. We're going to have to probably do a little more education with that. And it's starting to take place given the volatility of the market that it's happening with a number of other municipalities as well. But again, budgeted it on a worst case scenario in there. So you have both of those, not only for the upcoming 19-20 budget, but also forecasted in the succeeding years. So again, those details we're still working with Waste Management on it, but, you know, now I thought was probably a good idea to let you guys know that, that we're dealing with this, this issue right now.
Well, everybody else has a comment. I'll say I appreciate the update because that was going to be the questions I had, but you got to it before I asked it. As we've had the discussion before on recycling, and it's come up with the council, I think, in a work session, and I think the communication part of it is critical. We have to, we must be compliant, or it's going to have additional costs. And I think sometimes people have an understanding what recycling is. And at times they just think it's just a can, they put everything else, they don't throw in the trash into the recycle bin. And that's just not going to work. So I think it's that's a portion that we have to work on. The other is, of course, with the waste management and having some continued discussions that you've already had and Mr. Lewis has had about how we work at this collection and efforts together. So.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got to reconcile the number of units that are being collected, so.
Very good. Andrew?
If they provide, I'd be more than happy to work with them on the recycling item, especially since we're not so willing to, renegotiate costs as they came in to ask for. Have they provided us with any materials to disseminate, or have we put out a press release or a video on the Facebook page or through email to our residents?
We haven't done anything with that yet. Again, we got the audit results and basically didn't hear from them. I think, about a week ago, their representative reached out to Mr. Lewis and brought the topic up again, but we hadn't heard from them after the initial audit. So, yeah, we probably, they do provide information, brochures regarding, what products can be recycled, and I think from our end of it, to drive home the point of what products need to be in the recycling bin to mitigate any kind of surcharge for, having spoiled material in there.
Mm-hmm.
Are those brochures put in each resident's mailbox, or?
Well, the mailing, I think, went when the service was expanded last year, but it doesn't hurt to do a refresher. And so that was actually, I think, part of what they initially provided is direct mailing to that. But there's other ways, working with Jody Egan, how we can try and communicate broadly to the community to try and reduce the amount of spoilage that's contained therein.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting, not just what you can put in there, but maybe the examples they're seeing that are most frequently of what they are collecting here in the city that's causing the biggest problem. If you start with those and you take the higher percentages and remove them, we'll get closer there to the amount much quicker. So I think there's many ways to get to it, and looking forward to seeing how we message that as well.
I'm looking out to Mr. Lewis. Did they give us any breakdown as to what materials were being recycled? No. I didn't think so.
They just gave us a gross contamination rate.
Contamination, that's the.
They didn't give us X of this, Y of this.
Okay.
You receive your contamination.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we have discussions that would be beneficial. I mean, to really understand what it is they're saying is the contamination items, and then we can have a communication with the residents to remove that from the highest right on down to so we do get to the 8%. Okay.
They do put directions right on the
Yes,
lid.
they're on the lids. Yeah,
Yep.
that's
It
right.
says they want clean. Everything should be clean.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's the cleaning end of it. I think it's just product that is can't be recycled. So
Plastics, I understand, they'll just gum up the machines, and it causes them more grief and more time to have to clean it. And they're not getting picked out ahead of time, of course. And those wrappers that your newspaper comes in, that pink plastic, and it's not going to get recycled, but everything is plastic and they throw it in there. That's just one small example of items.
that's all I was going to add with
Okay.
the refuse fund.
Before I go on, it's strange how things happen, but you think you, Mayor, asked why public safety costs in the general fund went down from last year or this year to next year, and the answer just came to me. So included in public safety, required by the state of charter accounts, is the zoning code enforcement activity of the city. And in that zoning code enforcement activity is where we budget for demolitions. This year's budget probably includes close to $800,000 in demolition costs, whereas next year's at this point includes about 175,000. I think it's 125,000 actually. So that's the reason for the decrease from one year to the next, primarily. All right. Just popped into my head as you were discussing there, so I better get it out there. Building safety fund, again, is where we pay for those activities listed in the first two lines there. We did go through that permit fee increase, which took effect July 1st, but prior to that, the fund had been using a lot of its fund balance and actually ended the 2018 fiscal year with only $558 in fund balance. After the fees were increased, and actually in the first part of the year, it did pretty well in terms of permits issued and revenues generated. But we're kind of monitoring it to see how it goes the rest of this fiscal year. For future performance in terms of what those fees generate and whether the general fund will have to provide a subsidy just depends on the level of permit activity going forward here. And this is what the fund looks like in terms of a budget. And, you know, these were based when we did the inspection fees last year. Those fees were based on a certain level of permit activity. For example, building permits was based on having about 750 building permits per year issued, but also at certain construction value of those permits. So what our actual experience will be compared to that estimate last year is going to depend on how this fund turns out. But you can see in that 2018-19 projection column, I've highlighted $20,000 there, and that's the amount that the general fund would transfer to this fund to basically keep it out of a deficit, which is illegal per state law. So that's budgeted in both this fund and the general fund at this time. In the future, like I said, you see the appropriations is the total expenditures for the fund there. It is helped out a little bit by some restructuring where some of the costs were actually picked up by the general fund that had been here in the past, and where we are dropping one part-time position next year. But as I said, this is something we'll have to monitor and see where revenues are coming out in terms of permit fees and permit activity. Budget stabilization fund, it's still there. It's got $2 million in it, and we don't have any planned use for it at this time. The airport fund accounts for the direct operating costs of the Monroe-Custer Airport. Revenue sources are primarily fuel sales and hangar and farm rental, but we also do subsidize it from the general fund, as I had discussed. And the stores fund does charge, when we do snow plowing, for example, does charge for the use of the snow plows, the rent of the snow plows and use of the snow plows by the DPS staff. A lot of times we don't actually end up being able to keep that charge in place because the fund just can't afford it. So it's kind of another subsidy that's out there. Fund balance is estimated to be about $39,000 by the end of this. And those amounts listed there are what's currently recommended for the subsidies for fiscal year 18, 19, and then 20. One of the things we probably need to do is review what we're charging for our hangar rentals. Again, this is just breaking out where those costs by year. We ended last fiscal year with a fund balance of about $33,500, and it's budgeted just to really break even over the years and get up to about $38,000 by the end. The General Debt Service Fund, the bridge millage that we levied that was approved by voters back in 2010 is deposited into this fund, and any bond debt that we have issued gets paid out of this fund and is funded by that bridge millage. We also have City Hall debt that was issued along with those, and then the DDA parking project had a bond debt issue. So the general fund is transferring money into this fund to pay the City Hall bond payments. The DDA is transferring money into this fund to pay the parking lot project bond payments. The final bridge bond issue was in 2017, so we won't have any more of those at this point, but that's what the purpose of that fund is. And this kind of breaks it down again by year. At the end of the 2018 fiscal year, we had a fund balance in there of about $490,000. By the end, it's at $389,000. There is in that third year, there is a estimated refund if we were to have to make a tax refund included in there. More for just projection purposes at this time to see how things would look. So the main thing I wanted to point out with that is that if we did have a refund, this fund would have the money available, depending on how big the refund is, to pay back the amount related to the bridge millage. I guess I should say as well that that bridge millage was not primarily a debt service millage. So if somewhere in the future we see that this fund balance is increasing, it can be used for additional bridge improvements as well. So that's just something to monitor for the future.
Ed, before you move forward, because it's about 8 o'clock, unless you and Barry can get done in 1 minute, which I don't anticipate that, we have to make sure that council's aware that we're at our 2-hour mark, and unless there's objections to continue, and I have to ask the clerk treasurer also time-wise for.
Well, it's a special meeting, so I think we can
continue.
because it's not a work session, so I don't think we have to
Okay,
worry about it.
thanks.
But
We'll keep going.
I do need some water, so I may.
Where pretty soon we maybe could take a few minute break. If
Okay,
that'd be
sounds good.
Close to my end of the presentation where Barry and I would switch out.
All right, very good.
I did mention that I created a new fund for the Fire Station 1 debt service. So as you know, we issued $6 million in capital improvement bonds last fall at a true interest rate cost of 3.25%. The fire millage is the funding source of those, and so the millage will be deposited into this fund, and then the bond payments will be made out of it. It's its main purpose at this point. It just became too difficult to leave it in the general fund and track those funds versus other funds. It just made a lot of sense to have it in a separate fund. And just like the bridge millage, if we did have additional costs of constructing and equipping the fire station in the future that we needed to fund, and then the funds weren't needed for debt service, they could be transferred out for those purposes. Andrew?
Just a curiosity question, the $100,000 expenditure for furniture that we approved last week, that did come out of this fund, is that correct?
That will be paid out of the bond issues.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point, we haven't paid any construction costs or any costs related to the project directly out of the millage. The bond and the proceeds from the bond issue are paying everything at this point.
Because we haven't actually received those funds yet from the bonding.
Yes, we have received
from the
them. We
millage
received them
funds.
last fall.
Okay.
We've received them. We received, like I said, $6 million plus some premium money. And we've paid a number of payments out of them, to AUK for the construction costs and things like that.
I guess I misspoke. We haven't received the full amount of the millage funds because they're going to come in over time.
Yep, they'll be coming over a 20-year period, correct. Again, this is what the budget looks like for this. So since it's a new fund, there were no funds in it last year, and the funds we did levy the millage starting in the 2017 fiscal year. 2018 fiscal year. So the funds that we did collect that fiscal year will be transferred into this fund. They're actually sitting in our capital project fund right now, kind of just waiting to see what we were going to do with it. And then any revenue this fiscal year on forward will be deposited directly into this fund. And you can see what because we actually levied the millage a year before we had the bond debt service, it does have a sizable fund balance there, but that'll be paid down over the years as we pay bond payments. And the last fund I believe I have to talk about is the Stores and Equipment Fund. So we've talked about this in the past. The Stores and Equipment Fund is kind of like a motor pool fund. It's considered an internal service fund because it provides services to other departments of the city. Primarily, it provides equipment that other departments can use mostly vehicles, but also for our DPS operations that has some heavier equipment like trucks and backhoes and loaders and things like that. One of the reasons that we have this fund in place is that our street funds can't own property themselves. So this fund, when, for example, we're using a truck to plow the roads, rents that equipment on an hourly basis back to those street funds, and then we're able to charge that cost to those funding sources in the street funds. So that's one of the main reasons this fund was put in place in the first place. But so it accounts for the city's fleet operations, other equipment there as well. The actual DPS facilities are considered to be owned by this fund. And I said the primary revenue is renting that equipment that it owns back to the other city departments. It funds 2 mechanics, are the primary labor there, but some of the other DPS staff, such as the supervisors and even the administrative staff that do work related to this operation, charge their time back to it as well. The primary issue with the fund is it has old equipment that's in need of replacement, and so we've reviewed that, and on the next slide we'll get into that a little bit more, but this is also where we're accounting for the enterprise lease program. We're just starting year 2 of that and starting the second round of ordering vehicles with that. So $350,000 is budgeted for large equipment purchases next year, and based on our review of the working capital in the fund can afford to purchase those 2 vehicles without financing them, without going out and getting a loan. So we're expecting those to be 2 swap loader type trucks, and that's the plan at this point. In addition to that, there's another $321,000 budgeted for other types of equipment, such as 4 police vehicles and a couple trucks that didn't fit well into the enterprise program, and a couple other specialized pieces of equipment. So that's budgeted in the fund, and it looks like, based on the projections we have, that the fund can afford about $250,000 per year in equipment plus the enterprise lease payments at this point. So that's something we monitor every year in terms of where that fund is at in terms of its working capital available to continue making those purchases. Based on our budget projection right now, the working capital at the end of a 3-year period is expected to be at about $173,000. And those rental rates that we do charge, a lot of them are controlled by MDOT in terms of what we can charge back to specifically the street funds. But with our new leases, we can obviously see what we're paying for the lease, and then we add some costs for like fuel and maintenance and insurance on top of them, plus an overhead rate to cover the costs that this fund generates. We did increase those this year, and we'll look as to whether we need to do that in the future. This is just a review of, like I said, with the working capital for the fund. It's a little different than a governmental type fund in that you've got short-term assets like cash and receivables, but you've also got capital assets like buildings and trucks and things like that. Obviously, you can't buy things with buildings and trucks, so we look at working capital to see how much is in there to see whether we have funds to be able to continue operations and buy new equipment. So really what this slide is saying is at the end of at the end of last fiscal year, we ended with about $516,000 in working capital. By the end of this 3-year projection, you can see we're down to $173,000, primarily because of some of those, like I talked about, those larger equipment purchases. $350,000 of it being next year. So we'll look at this. There's more that's needed than just a couple trucks out of that fund. So next year when we do the budget, we'll run this process again and see where we're at. And it may be necessary that we'll need to finance some of those bigger purchases. But at this point, we're looking at just buying those 2 trucks this year and then seeing where we're at again next year. And I did forget I have one more fund to talk about. But this one I don't have much to say about. This is, and I can barely see it, so I'm really not going to say much about it. So this is the Port of Monroe's budget that they submitted. And what I would say is that, I'm going to look up here. In that yellow column is their budget proposal. In that first section there are their operating revenues, and it breaks it down into those 3 separate line items, but they've also provided projections for the following 2 years as well. in that second section are their operating expenses. So you get down to like the third line from the bottom there, and you see their total operating expenses. And then the next line is just the difference between their operating income and it's a loss. Part of the reason of that is if you go to the next section, you'll see that their funding from the city of $400,000 is considered a non-operating revenue, is included in that section, as well as one other item related to the Brownfield Authority. So that section, that non-operating section, actually funds the non-operating loss at the top, so that their total, they're budgeting to net zero, basically, no change in net assets. In that first column, that white column, you see the change in net assets amount there. It's a pretty big amount, but that wasn't expenditures that they made. They actually donated a piece of land, might have been more than one piece of land, back to the Battlefield project. So when that came off their books, it had to come off as an expenditure, and that's the only reason that they had a negative. If it wasn't for that, they would have actually had a net increase in net assets of about, I believe it was about $61,000 last year. So that is the port budget. It does keep things, like I said, revenue expense balanced. It allows for addition of a part-time employee. And it does budget for the intergovernmental agreement that the port has with the city as well. And that intergovernmental agreement is that basically that they fund $50,000 a year towards our economic development functions. Break time? Question?
Questions, follow-up questions for Ed? I know there's a lot of information here, plus what was shared with us from Mr. Sell prior to the meeting, and opportunities to review all that yet again through the week before we come back to their April 1st meeting. Some of the maybe detail items that I'm sure he'll be prepared to respond to if they come up. And of course, you could forward those along as well if it's something just might move it along if he has an idea what might be asked. So there's no questions. Mr. Pastu?
Are we ready for the water and wastewater presentation?
I think so.
Okay. Obviously, we've had some discussion over the last year about some of the projects that we have ongoing with wastewater operation, and also certainly the lead and copper regulation that is ongoing. We'll go through both water and wastewater, and there's a pretty sizable increase that we're looking at on the water end of it over the next few years. And but I think but we also talked about that in the past, that this was coming as a result of some of the regulatory changes. So I'll let Barry jump into it. He has a pretty good presentation here that we've seen a couple times, especially the first portion of it, the wastewater. So Barry?
Yep. Okay, Mayor and Council, Barry Leroy, Director of Water and Wastewater. Okay, jumping right into wastewater. These are some goals for the next upcoming fiscal year. We're proposing to add a part-time position in the wastewater side in our heavy equipment, as a heavy equipment operator. We'll be able to do more manhole inspections. We have a 10 and 20-year preventative maintenance program. This will put us more in line with being able to keep up with that pace that we haven't had before. We'll be able to do more closed-circuit TV work, and we'll get about 261 miles of sewer to TV every 20 years. That's about 69,000 feet a year, so we'll be able to keep up with that pace. As far as our NPDES permit goes, we have our corrective action plan that we're currently working on. We're in our phase 2 of flow monitoring, and we're expecting to be finishing that later this year. We'll jump right into the actual design of what corrections we need to make on the system to bring us into certification for meeting the state's remedial design standard. That's the reason for the whole corrective action plan. So the net result will be a basis of design report that we will end up with. Just from a timing standpoint, it takes several months to be able to do the design work, so we're actually funding to do the design work in this upcoming fiscal year. And you'll see those numbers when I get into that. The next bullet is our NPDS permit. We have to renew that as well this year. So I'm actually reviewing the permit application right now because it's due the 1st of April. The next bullet, Ed already mentioned about the capital improvements program that was approved. These are the projects just as a summary that will work through the next fiscal year. And inflow and infiltration is a big target for us. We've expanded the means on how we are able to obtain that information and work with homeowners and the customers to mitigate those through complaint methods to cross-connection inspection, et cetera. And then we educate them as well as what that does and try to mitigate that clear water, removing that from the system. This slide is just a showing the net expenses and the revenues, and the $14 million line here, 14.6 in expenses, and the 14.2 are real close. It just kind of illustrates the benefit of having a rate model and looking out 10 years and trying to always balance the revenues and expenses. And then this is a summary of our expenses for this next upcoming fiscal year. Our operations maintenance has about a 34% increase. And that is that $700,000+ figure there is our corrective action plan design. The estimate we had from a few years ago from a project that would be needed showed about a $14 million project. This is a percentage of that based on the design cost that would be expected. We really don't know the scope of the project until we get the basic design report to kind of have a more finite number on that. But I mean, this is the best information we have at this time. Reimbursement fees, those are the city reimbursement fees. We have about a 9% increase in that, and that is made up of the increases are primarily in meter reading, administrative support, and information system user fees. As far as fringe benefits, insurance, pension, Ed mentioned, in the healthcare insurances. Labor, we have some increase in there, primarily to step raises. We're writing that part-time position and a little bit in overtime, and then a small percentage of that is the value of the system that's went up for depreciation purposes. And again, drilling down a little further into the specifics, the general contractual component, we already talked about the corrective action plan design increase. That's a huge number. But it will be reimbursed likely through a bond. That is built into the rate model as well. So if we have to front $700,000, we would get that back through a bond proceed back into the reserves. The increase in pension that Ed elaborated, wastewater's portion is about $200,000 of that.
How many?
Excuse me, 33,000.
Okay,
Wrong
thank
number.
you.
Wrong number. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes, not yours. Yeah, sorry about that. You have to make sure everybody's awake. Sludge handling, landfill. Last fall, our landfill notified us that they only take one load a day, and we had to go get a secondary, and that changed our haulers cost as well. So we're expecting to have similar increases when we go to bid this out this upcoming fiscal year. Insurances are increasing, and then retiree healthcare savings. We have a lot more newer employees are hybrid, where they have their own retiree healthcare savings account, so those costs will increase in our budget. And then the last portion, just some efficiencies to try to help mitigate these cost increases.
If you go back there, Jeff, again, you know, I think if there's anything I can reiterate, that $718,000, it is an estimated cost for engineering design, and we'll know more probably later this fiscal year, well, later next fiscal year, what that will look like. And again, once that scope of work is known, that number will change, but even if it doesn't, it can be reimbursed as part of a bond issue. So you incur it as an expense, but later on that cost gets amortized probably over a period of 20 years when you issue the bonds. So it is a sizable jump, but it would get recovered later on. So,
Andrew?
We are seeing sizable increases both in pension, is that contribution or payments? And then retiree healthcare savings plans, which usually you would see those move in opposite directions. Is it just because the former staff was so much larger than current staff for this particular department, or?
I'm going to do a really bad job of saying this, and that's why I'm going to ask Ed to explain the retiree healthcare because of the new employee package that we offer.
I think you got to remember is with that pension number, it's kind of a lagging number. So that number is going to represent something that the actuary calculated as of December 31st, 2017. And said, okay, as of this date, based on your workforce and all these other assumptions that I take into account, the city should put this amount into the system. So since that time, some people could have retired and so on and so forth. Obviously, but that retiree health savings plan account, we know who we're budgeting for on a current basis, and it's a go-forward number. It's not a past number. So with the retiree healthcare savings plan is basically a defined contribution type of retiree healthcare plan. And so the city puts in 3% and the employee puts in 3% of an average base wage. So it's the same for everybody. And it goes into an account for them. It's nothing that the city has to fund as if and make lots of assumptions on.
We absolve ourselves of future pension obligations.
While that 15% is kind of a big number, I think it amounts to $4,000 or $5,000.
Right.
So it's not a big number.
It's not the overall amounts. That's not what bothers me at all. It's just that they're both moving in the same direction. And usually as you would remove people from pension plans, you'd see an increase in retirement health savings. But to have them both go up at the same time
we're
is
not removing people from the pension plan, though.
It's just the new hires aren't getting put on it.
Every new hire is still going to be in the pension system. But instead of being in the old retiree healthcare system where you get an insurance paid for you when you retire, they're now into this defined contribution type retiree healthcare plan. So everybody still goes in the pension system.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Moving on to some just some general trends. Our connections continue to increase. It's the top portion here, and then our usage has been historically dropping since about fiscal year 2007. We are projecting about a 0.5% reduction this next fiscal year. As far as rates, what we're proposing, this last fiscal year we actually funded to do a meter read and bond recovery charge study. Our current process that we're currently billing for and will be changing is based on, there's a meter read charge portion and then there's a bond recovery portion based on classification. So if it's commercial, industrial, they all get different bond recovery charges on a quarterly basis. The study took that information and reviewed it, and the recommendation came back to be based on meter size as a fair and equitable way to recover those costs. And we defined what those percentages are, and it's more defensible that way. And that's actually how our water meter fixed charges are allocated. So what you'll see here is we have a quarterly cost per read, and you'll see the meter sizes on the left is 5/8, and it drives all the way up to 12-inch. And then over on the right it's just monthly. It's roughly a third. And that's a change from our current process and what we would be recommending to go forward on July 1st. We're also recommending an increase in commodity charge. That's about a 4.7% increase. It's about 19 cents per unit increase. We're recommending to maintain all the septic dump charge, dumping rate, and the BOD surcharge, TSS, and nitrogen surcharge rates as well. So what that boils down to, it's about a 2.3% increase, and that's for about 94% of our customer base. And those are all 5/8-inch meters. Okay, fitting it into the new regime of meter read and bond recovery charges. About 0.8% of that is that operation and maintenance. Again, we would get recovered that through a bond proceed. Depreciation is about 0.5. Reimbursement fees about 0.4. Labor 0.4, and fringe is about 0.2. There's some assumptions there, or a bullet point there on the right indicating the cap. Flow monitoring is included, as well as the base of design reports and design specifications. We also have, built into the model bond, a future bond. In 2021 is when we're calculating it, be based on our schedule that we have to meet. for our corrective action plan project. We also have built in there the future pension, labor, and fringe increases, as well as our capital improvements. It's a holistic model, and it also includes our desired working reserves. So with all that information, this bottom graphic is our wastewater sales. As I mentioned, this is the pattern up here on the peak is about fiscal year 2007, 2008. And you can see the decrease in usage that has been observed from a combination of things. People are definitely tightening up their usage. And we kind of projected that in the model, as you can see the drop as well. But about 68% of the system is the metropolitan side. That's the city of Monroe, Monroe Township, and a little bit of Raisonville. And that's about 15% down since 2007, 2008. And the balance is from Frenchtown, and they're about 23% down. So with this rate increase, this is how the sewer rates compare regionally. Yeah, again, we're in the middle of the pack. Just some points, though, about these other systems. Woodhaven, Flat Rock, and Wyandotte are what do they call collection systems. They collect the sewage, and then they actually send it to Detroit for treatment. They don't have their own treatment facilities. There's a lot of small systems, and a small system is like 0 to about 2 million gallons a day. So like maybe London, Ida, Raisonville, Petersburg, Tecumseh, and Howell, those are considered small systems. Adrian's about 5 million gallons a day. We're about 13, and we service about 51,000 people. Ypsilanti Utility Authority, they're about 23 million gallons a day. Ironically, they only service about 22,000 people because they accept a lot of bulk sewage from other smaller facilities. So, you know, I guess our population base with our usage is, I think we're doing pretty well with our rates, you know, considering the size plant we have and obligations we're required to meet. Okay, so again, this slide here is just our proposed rates again. And then, as I mentioned, the average customer, which makes up about 94% of our customer base, they'll see about a $9 increase per year. And then we have several sewer flat customers. Those are customers that do not have a water meter and just are connected to the sewer system. They would be seeing about a $7.50 increase per year. And then just doing a check, so the EPA recommends your medium household income should be, you should spend about 2% or less on your medium household income on wastewater. And then there's a lot of case studies out there, and one that I follow is it's called the second quintile household income, and that's about your 20 to 40% income rate. And our wastewater annual cost estimated is significantly below that. And then this last slide, which I think I left one of these, everybody, slide or location. This is kind of since we're converting systems from our current method to meter-based, it really shifts a lot of the fixed cost to the larger meters. And the top line is your 94% of your system customers. Your 5/8 inch meter and about 20 units a quarter. They'll see again about a 2.3% increase. And then you'll see the next line below there is about a 2-person customer with a 5/8 inch meter. They'll see about a 1.6% increase. And then so on, you'll see a larger family with about 30 units, about a 3% increase. And then you'll see, like, as the meter sizes get bigger, it starts to increase a little more. A family with a 1-inch meter, a little bit higher, about 22%. Then a commercial customer with an 1.5 inch, about 16%. School that has a 2-inch meter would see a little bit higher, about 16%. And then a multi-residential, like an apartment complex, they use a lot more water and sewer, about a 24%. And then an industrial customer is about a 32% increase. This is a shift in the method is really what we're accomplishing here with this process to make us more defensible and fair and equitable. Sorry, Vince, go ahead.
Well, I think what happened is in a lot of cases, if you will, the readiness to serve charge was probably understated, and the effect was the larger commercial-related type of services were being subsidized, if you will, to a certain extent by some of the smaller residential. So, you're looking at about 75 cents on average for the residential unit per month increase, but it is far more equitable to go this route as a result of the study that was conducted this last year. And certainly, Barry had presented twice to our Metropolitan Sewer Authority, and they recommended approval of these rates for all system users. So.
Is there any questions on the wastewater at this point before we jump into water?
Questions for Mr. Leroy? See none.
Okay. So jumping into water. We've talked about a lot of these regulatory requirements, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them. The 2018 lead and copper rule revisions, that has a significant hit for us. It requires several things, and some of the top ones are optimized corrosion control, which we are currently, it's an ongoing process. A lot of testing, sampling, working with customers and other vendors. We have field verification. There's about 2,800 locations that we have to field verify over a 5-year period. This budget does include that, starting that process, I should say, not all of it. There's about 36 out of those 2,800 locations, plus what's known already in lead and galvanized. It's about 3,600 locations. Okay, that's about 190 is what we have budgeted in here per year for replacing. And the state requires you to replace those over a 20-year period. In our asset management plan, we propose to do it over a longer period of time to coordinate it more with our roadway projects. We'd like to only tear it up once and go in there and do it when the funding's available. So thus far, we have not heard back from the state, probably because it's currently being challenged, that rule. Another regulatory requirement that we started on July 1st, 2018 was the residential cross-connection program. We've built that into our current operations. Every time we go into a house, we obtain that information and work with the customers, therefore, and implement it. We're currently doing a study that council approved. It's a short-term and long-term MDEQ sanitary sewer requirements. There will be some projects likely coming out of that will be recommended to maintain compliance. I don't have those at this point because the study's ongoing. As far as non-regulatory, we do have about 8,000 meters, and then we were planning for this a few years ago. It's built into the rate model. We have to replace about 8,000 meters coming up over the next 7 years. On top of that, we had a future CIP to put in a fixed-based meter read system, and the benefit with that is being able to read the meters from inside the office versus having to go out and drive and manually obtain that information. It cuts down on leaks. It's customer-based oriented. It has a smart app with it. So we've investigated 3 different vendors for that, and the one that makes the most sense, because we don't have to install a lot of 75-foot poles everywhere, is a cellular-based solution with Badger. It's called the Badger Beacon Advanced Metering Analytics, excuse me. And we're proposing to do an 8-year project with this. Fiscal year 1920 would be year 1. And we looked at it from a revenue standpoint. Almost half of our revenue comes from our non-residential customers. So all the commercial, industrial customers, apartment complexes, that makes up over half of our revenue. We're proposing to convert their meters over to the new meter reading system and then start them on monthly billing. And then they can sign up for the smart app and be able to utilize that benefit. And then years 2 through 8 would be the residential customers. We would do it by 2 cycles a year. The benefit with doing that is then customers can then also take advantage of that app and be converted to that. We do see a lot of customer service benefits with this technology. We get to utilize existing cell towers. There is a cost, obviously, to read the meter, but we did get some nice pricing proposed from Badger. And the cost for this work to convert it is built into here from a contractual and material base. So we have about 14,000 residential meters that would be done over the last 7 years of that process. Another item to mention is, as Ed mentioned, we have a part-time position that we are adding. Actually, there's a second part-time position that was in the meter shop that we corrected this time around. So we're at about 28.6 full-time equivalents, and they will help with the residential cross-connection program with inputting data and making sure we get letters out and notices accordingly. Helping implement the lead and copper rule revisions. Just coordination is amazing on the number of times you have to get into someone's house, just trying to mitigate that so you don't have to do that 5 times. The meter conversion project, coordinating that with our contractor and our customers, and also implementing the monthly billing process. We talked, and this next, sorry.
Something tells me we're going to be on this slide for a while. In terms of field verification of the 2,800 facilities that you have listed, I know that we talked about this previously at work session. Do we think that we could advance the timeline enough so that we wouldn't have to incur those expenditures twice, that we could repair them at the same time as we identify what they are? So we wouldn't have to go back to the same location, verify, leave, then come back again and replace the line. You know what I'm saying?
As far as that means we would be replacing 2,800 services in 5 years.
It would be, and statute requires that they be verified in a 5-year period.
The reasoning for that with the legislation that was, well, now law, is for you to update all your records. Like if you have missing data, so like if we have an unknown material, that's the purpose of it. I agree, it makes a lot of sense to replace that at the same time, but again, it boils down to funding. We're planning on 190 a year. That's 565 a year. So I guess that's council's will if we want to move in that direction.
Have we looked at or explored any of the low interest loans that the state is offering specifically to implement this project?
We could apply for a drinking water revolving loan fund. It is we're competing with other communities. We have applied for those in the past, and we were lucky enough to get one primarily about 10 years ago, and we got 40% principal forgiveness at that point. So that is an option as well if we want to pursue that in that direction. But again, they give you 20 years to do the work. But I know what you're saying. If we're going to do that, that means we'll be digging up the roads twice versus once. So I guess that's, again, a council will if that's the direction.
It's frustrating no matter which way you look at it.
Well, it does require a lot of planning with that because, you know, and clearly I will tell you, Barry and Patrick work closely of planning our utility projects with the road projects coming behind it. You know, there are aspects there where we could do it maybe in an expedited manner, but as Barry said, okay, you've got now a patch in the road that's going to be there for a period of time before, and then come back at a later period to do that, as well as main replacement. I mean, you know, a lot of what's taking place on Hollywood is just flat out replacing the water main. And we've got large segments of our community where that just needs to happen. It's time. It's probably overdue in many regards. So it is, it's a juggling act to try and be as effective and as efficient with the use of the money, but and comply with the regulatory requirements related to that. So
while we're on the topic, and I know it's only been a week, have we thought any more about direct hires for the directional drilling team that we might want to employ?
We have some estimated numbers to hire another crew with the equipment. That's estimated, that's not in this budget, but that was estimated about $615,000 roughly to get started.
How much of that is capital?
Probably about 260,000 roughly.
So then you're talking about a 400,000 recurring cost,
right? Unless we were to lease equipment,
okay.
Then at least it would be smaller payments.
there would still be a lot more analysis to be done. You know, what's the value of having continuing working with a limited contractor universe versus doing it ourselves. So there's a ways to go. I will tell you, till, as I said a week ago, I probably would have never given much thought to it. Now I will, based on what we're seeing and what we anticipate, more importantly.
Councilwoman.
Mine's easy. Will the smart app enable payment processing and paperless billing to happen?
Right, yeah, you currently can get paperless billing now.
You can.
Yes, yeah, through our
We're gonna have to do that.
ACH, you could sign up for automatic pay as well with your ACH, but yeah, you can also get e-billing. So yeah, that information will be available. As far as payments, it would use, I believe it could be linked to our third-party company now that we use.
So we could implement this with the My Monroe on the Go app.
I haven't gotten that far on it yet, but yes, I'm
Would be,
sure it's easily.
You're talking about the current payment system.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, that's what we're looking at, is kind of a paperless electronic payment system for the billing and payment receipt. But there's a lot more to do. Part of the rationale, as Barry and I had talked about, is although we're not going to be maybe taking payments, from our large customers, they'll still pay in the way they always have. But clearly, I think we get a better handle with 50% of our customers, having a good handle on where we are with the meter, with the flow and what have you. So, but ultimately, from a residential standpoint, we want to get to a point much like what you do with your other utilities, whether it's your natural gas or electric bill, where, those apps can tell you how much you're using, and particularly if there's a water loss, you'll get an alert and those type of things. So from a customer experience standpoint, that's really where we're trying to get to over a period of time.
Yeah, if I may add just a little bit about the metering system they are looking at. It's quite unique. It does give you the flow. It also gives you an alert if you get backflow. So like if water's flowing back into the public system. It also can read pressures. So that's unique.
That's right. Yeah.
So we could also, update our water model for doing design work. So anyway, it's got a lot of benefits. It also has more bells and whistles, but we didn't go that route. I mean, has automatic meter valves you can shut off. Can do testing. But anyway, we didn't go that route at this point. So.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Next.
Onward.
All right. So just continuing on this this process. Last year, DTE gave us notice that they were going to cut down on their usage. It's still kind of indeterminate. They started late last fall. We do see reductions in usage. This last quarter, I was surprised they actually used more than I was anticipating. So I almost need a couple of cycles of annual usage to kind of get our handle on that. But that's kind of the range, about 300,000 to 700,000 a year reduction that we're expecting. As Vince has pointed out, maintaining funding, renewing our infrastructure. This is per our asset management plan, but regulatory has a huge component of that kind of drives us to that. The nemesis with our western basin of Lake Erie, the algal bloom problem that we constantly are dealing with. The costs continue to increase with regard to how to deal with those. But we did get a blessing with getting some of the replacement equipment replaced with our monitoring equipment last year. So through the state of Michigan, that was administered by SEMCOG. So what does that mean as far as to our average customer, which is a residential customer? So for fiscal year 1920, we're recommending about a 9.7% increase, and then we threw in there the next couple of fiscal years just so you get an idea of a lot of what these goals and requirements are moving towards. Fiscal year 2021 is about an 8.7% increase, and 21-22 is an 8.6% increase. We will obviously keep refining these. I was looking at last year's rate model, and we had 9.1 predicted and 9.5 next fiscal year. So we weren't too far off, but it's still higher. So
I remember a number of meetings ago saying, don't be surprised if you're seeing 8% for the next 5 years. When we actually get out years 4 and 5, it flattens out again.
Right, it drops right off.
But you know, that 9.7 from a cash flow standpoint, as Mr. Sull had talked about paying back that loan, has a substantial impact because that thing was going to be a lot higher than 9.7. And so it is part of what we have to do to maintain the system, the regulatory requirements that we have, and obviously the meter conversion improvements with that. The other one is with that top bullet there. Again, with that reduction, part of the meter change in the philosophy is moving closer toward a readiness to serve type of increase, if you will. And part of the rationale is, look, if you're going to have that access to capacity of our system, you should be paying for some of that availability, and rather than just wait to pay a consumption charge. So there is a bit of a change with that methodology as well. So on the next one.
All right. One thing I want to point out with the metering as well, conversion with the 8 years, with the 8,000 meters. We do have a high unaccounted for water. And that, by changing the meters, that'll help us reconcile on a monthly basis with the amount of water we're treating at the plant and pumping out into the system. We'll be able to measure that and verify so we can kind of hone in on mitigating that unaccounted for water. So that's another one of the goals with that conversion process. Okay, this slide here is similar to the wastewater, just kind of shows the expense as well as the revenue. We are dipping into reserves a little bit this fiscal year upcoming. But again, just from looking back, the rate model does a pretty good job of helping us keep that in line. As far as the increases, we talked about quite a few of these already, but we're seeing about a 53% increase in operations and maintenance. It's a combination of the water plant with various areas, the distribution system, and the meter shop. The water plant has a wastewater increase cost. That's really has to do with the algal bloom problem and chemicals and electricity. We are funding a raw water line evaluation. That's over a several-year process. We talked about the service renewal process with labor, equipment, material. We are renting all of our trucks now from DPS, so our rental costs have increased quite a bit. We talked about the field verification process. We are that's a contractual service that we're working with some local companies to help us complete that task. Pavement repairs. There's going to be a lot more pavement repairs we have to fund, and contractual. On the meter shop side, we talked about the meters, and that does come with a new cost with our cellular costs that will start to increase as new customers come on. As far as labor, that's step raises and overtime. We are expecting to have to do a lot of service work on overtime to help meet customer needs. Most people work during the day, and we're trying to work as close as possible with our contractors and with homeowners to accommodate everybody. And to verify materials. Fringe benefits, we did talk about the pension and healthcare increases, about a 12% increase. Reimbursement fees, that's increase in the administrative support, rent charges, information system user fees. And again, the value of the system is increased. So there's a small increase on that. We talked about water service renewal already quite a bit. On the specific areas, our pension program, our pensions increased about 30%. I know Ed has described that on the wastewater. It's very similar on the water as well. Our overtime, as I mentioned, has increased for our cross-connection inspections and verifying materials and renewal costs. Insurances is about 7% concerned, as well as retiree health care. Again, that's the defined benefit for new hires. And then our chemical costs, we're projecting based on the current costs that we have, we're expecting those to increase as well. All right. This next slide is just showing the consumption, and it's also showing the active connections, trends-wise. And then here's the proposed rates. We are proposed to maintain the fire line, the pump surcharge, and the system development fees. We're proposing to increase the administrative recharge and the debt service recharge. We're trying to recover about 39% of our admin and about 61% of our debt service charges. And we're proposing to increase the commodity charge about 2%. So a city resident would pay about $2 a unit, non-city resident about $4, and then the surcharge is about 16 cents. And our wholesalers would be at $2.16 a unit. This is the next slide is our proposed read charges. Again, since we're proposing to go to monthly, we got the quarterly and monthly charges there, and they're really similar to the wastewater charges that were shown. This next slide is the proposed fire line quarterly and monthly charges, and then our system development fees. And then, you know, what does it look like to an average customer and looking at the region? We're still doing pretty good competitive-wise. A city customer will pay about $208 a year based on an average residential home using about 18 units a quarter. That's about a 9.7% increase. If you live outside the city, it'll be about $384, and then about $395 with the customers that have the surcharge added to it. Just checking the costs with the medium household income. It's 2.5% for water. We're definitely below that, even on the highest customer base. The second quintile income level is it's about a little bit more than half of that. So, and then this last slide is just a breakdown of our average customer increase. About 4.2% of it is geared towards regulatory. Or excuse me, about 7.8% of it is operation and maintenance. 4.2% of that is actually regulatory based, and then 3.6 is geared towards our meter conversion program. 0.6 is fringe benefits as well as reimbursement fees. Labor is 0.5 and depreciation is 0.2. And then just looking at the consumption, you know, not trying to be in bad news, but I'm just trying to show you the facts. 58% of the system is the city of Monroe, and we're about 26% down from where we were in fiscal year 2006. You can see the progression that's jumped around quite a bit. The DTE has given us notice. It's just more of a point in time at this point, but 2018-19 fiscal year, and we are kind of planning for a slight decrease like we did with the wastewater as well. So with that, is there any?
You know, if you could go back a couple of slides there, right there, you can see that, you know, with the proposed increase, the annual cost for a customer, residential customer, would be about $208, correct, Barry? Now let's go back to the sanitary sewer or the wastewater. I think we went too far.
Oh,
is that the one with the 408? Yeah. Okay. So we're looking at an average customer going from an annual cost of, is that the right one? Yeah.
Oh, you want I'm sorry. I know what you want now.
Yeah, right there. So we're at 407 based on the proposed increase with sewer rates. And this is an annual cost. Where I'm going with this is if you take a weighted average of water increase and wastewater increase, you're looking at about 3.5% increase, assuming my math is right, and about $27 a year more, or $2 a month, $6.50 a quarter is what the impacts would be based on the proposed changes. So clearly the water, or the wastewater end of it is more costly portion of the quarterly bill, and that percent was smaller. So again, taking the weighted average, you're looking somewhere around 3.5% roughly. So overall for both water and wastewater.
Andrew.
And so as a result of these rate increases, we do not anticipate special assessing those persons whose service lines we are replacing as a result of the lead and copper rule. essentially this rate increase is to go to pay for those. Is that correct?
That's correct. The state law does not allow you to special assess customers on an individual basis. It must be paid for by the water system.
So it's nice to know that you're getting something for your money. There was one other thing. I guess I forgot.
While you ponder, if there's other questions. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks, Barry.
You're up.
We're basically done. I just wanted to point out that these are the other funds that we do create budgets for. And invite, if you have any questions about any of them, please reach out to me or even ask them right now if you'd like to. But in addition to the main funds we did cover, we do have budgets that we'll be adopting for all of these funds as well. You have to answer any questions about those. Other than that, it's just open for questions and discussion at this point.
Go back to the last slide for a second.
Last slide.
So I know there was been some discussion, and we've talked about some of the other items that come up for, I'll just say, repairs or needs. I know we have funds that come through that's being held by the community foundation. That there's a cemetery fund, but also like the fountain, stuff like that. Is there any change, or are we just going to kind of do by a need basis when we talked about some of the potential project or work at the cemetery or items like that was included in this year, or are we just going to look at it as it comes forward? I know we haven't discussed really what that is. We just, it was items that were, how do we look at that, some of the care and maintenance?
For example, I think, we'll have at our next meeting recommended action to approve lawn maintenance contracts, negotiating with the firm that we've worked with in the past, but not the one that's handled the cemetery. It will be an increase.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, you're going to get the due care that I think,
correct.
We understood the council was looking for. As far as some of the other things, whether the cemetery fund, I think there was some potential looking at the county funds for some potential rehab, if you will, of some of the markers and monuments. We could pursue that, and then maybe even potentially looking at the cemetery as kind of more of a perpetual care type of fund, whether some proceeds could be applied there as well. So, but I
would say that the lawn maintenance or the weeds, grass weeds you talked about is included in this budget. We have included that increase in here, and I know Jeff Green has been working on an application for those other funds. He's been getting some information for me this week to apply for it, so that's in the works. But beyond those two things, we haven't made any other changes in the budget yet.
Okay.
That answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
I just was more, I know that we just started some discussion. I know there's going to be follow-up, but it gets what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, we did put the, as Ed indicated, we put the extra money in there for the maintenance of the cemetery.
Okay. See if there's no other questions.
Well, where do you want to go from here? Is there any desire to hold any other work sessions over any of the material that we've went over tonight, or are you comfortable, or just need time to ponder and think about it?
3 more hours tonight, sure. No, of course, I'm just joking. But I think it's like I said before, there's a lot of information here. And I also realize that, you start looking at lines like this and going back and review back over them. I'm sure over this next week as we get prepared for the next, the council meeting, which is the first read, there may be hopefully some discussion at that point before we get to the final read. And as was pointed out, Mr. Sell, there's, it's by the end of April, so there's other time if there was a need for a meeting that came up afterwards. But hopefully, had to have time this week to kind of go through that and maybe send some questions forward. If not, at the meeting on a week from today, we see if there's other questions. But please send them in if you can. They might be able to resolve them that way too.
And maybe we'll just set aside on the
Yeah.
budget work session, or the work session for the first, if
Yeah.
there's any follow-up items that the council would like to discuss at that point, so.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Of course, if there's considerations of some adjustments, bring those forward to the council so we can all kind of have that dialogue and listen to what each of us are thinking is a good thing to have. So we'll have time to do that probably in, like I said, a work session before, or at least the first reading.
Yeah. I would say when we put these presentations together, you know, there's a ton of information that we could be here for another couple hours if we really want to. But we try to, you know, hit the big things, the big important things, and show you what's different from last year to this year, and show you the big picture. So if there's any specific questions you have about anything, feel free to reach out to me or, of course, Vince.
Yeah. And if there's adjustments or maybe recommendations or changes, as I said, we'll bring them forward to collectively so we can kind of all share in a conversation would be great. So thanks for all the work to Ed, Mr. Pastu, and of course the staff.
Yep.
Thank you for trying to predict the future.
Yeah. Other questions? Anything else? I think we just need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Motion from Councilman Lamore, supported by Councilwoman Germaine. Jim, would you all in favor? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? None. Thank you all.